I would like to call this board meeting to order and welcome everyone who is attending. We have a number of guests for several agenda items this evening. I would like to acknowledge that we are meeting from many locations in unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin territory. We thank the Algonquin Nation for hosting us, and we recognize their enduring presence on this land. Could I have a motion to approve the agenda, please? Moved by Trustee Schwartz and seconded by Trustee Boothby. Is there any discussion on the agenda? Seeing none, I'll call the question then. All those in favor of the agenda as presented? And opposed? And the motion is carried. Next, we have report from board in camera, and I will call upon Vice Chair Keith Penny to present the report.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And the board met in camera this evening and reports and recommends as follows. On a motion by Trustee Boothby, which I will second, that staff be authorized to proceed as directed in board in camera with respect to a financial matter.
We held our discussion and debate in camera. This will be a recorded vote, and I will ask Manager Guthrie if she would please conduct the vote.
Trustee Boothby? In favor. Trustee Blackburn?
In favor.
Trustee Huff? Trustee Campbell?
In favor.
Trustee Ellis?
In favor.
Trustee Jenkins?
In favor.
Trustee Penny?
In favor.
Trustee Evans? Sorry, Trustee Lyra. Trustee Bell?
In favor.
Trustee Fisher?
In favor.
Trustee Schwartz?
In favor.
Trustee Scott?
In favor.
That is 10 in favor.
And is that 10 present and 10 in favor? Or is there anyone present who has not voted?
Trustee
Trustee
Huff
Huff.
just appeared. Sorry, I can't vote because I have absolutely no idea what you just voted on.
Thank you for that. So the motion is carried then with 10 in favor. And that moves on to the next item, Mr. Vice Chair.
Thank you very much. And the next item is on a motion by Trustee Campbell, which I will second, that staff be authorized to proceed as directed in board in camera with respect to a human resources matter.
And again, we've held our discussion and debate in camera. And I will call upon Manager Guthrie to conduct a recorded vote.
Trustee Boothby? In favor. Trustee Blackburn?
In favor.
Trustee Huff?
In favor.
Trustee Campbell?
In favor.
Trustee Ellis?
In favor.
Trustee Jenkins?
In favor.
Trustee Penny?
In favor.
Trustee Lyra?
Opposed.
Trustee Bell?
In favor.
Trustee Fisher?
In favor.
Trustee Schwartz?
In favor.
Trustee Scott?
In favor.
And that is 11 in favor, 1 opposed.
And so the motion is carried. Thank you very much. And Mr. Vice Chair, is there anything further in your report?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. No, that concludes my report.
Thank you. That brings us then to briefing from the chair of the board. And this week, the Education Foundation of Ottawa will be holding a special fundraiser for its Bridges Over Barriers, or BOB fund. They're calling it What's Up with Bob, and asking you to take part in a fun social media activity and donate. The goal is to raise $100,000, which will support the work being done by social workers in OCDSB schools. To learn more about this initiative or to donate, please visit the Education Foundation of Ottawa website. I also wanted to mention an article in the Ottawa Business Journal's Gift Giving Guide by Executive Director Clarissa Arthur. In it, she discusses Black Lives Matter and representation in the charitable sector. Check our social media to read more. The Education Foundation of Ottawa continues to provide critical support to students in our district, and we thank Ms. Arthur for her leadership. On Tuesday, December the 8th, we will be hosting an Indigenous Speaker Series event for grades 7 to 12 students and staff. Our presenter will be Isaac Murdoch, an Indigenous artist and environmentalist. He is currently working on a new book and will be sharing his experiences with the writing process and the process of getting a book published. Finally, the Ottawa Safety Council has asked us to share with the community information about new crossing guard safety measures. Crossing guards will now be using a whistle to let pedestrians know when it's safe to cross and ensure motorists are stopped. 2 short whistle blasts will mean it is safe to walk across the road. This is a great opportunity to remind us all about the important work of our crossing guards in keeping our children safe. And that concludes my briefing. Are there any questions? Seeing none, we will move on to item 5 on our agenda, briefing from the director. Madam Director.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On December the 2nd, the OCDSB is hosting a virtual conference for students in grades 11 and 12 to explore going to college or university, starting an apprenticeship, entering the workforce, starting a business, or taking a gap year. The event will help students to gather information and hear about different learning experiences and opportunities from current students, apprentices, and employees. Visit our website to register and to learn more. Last week, Youth Ottawa and the OCDSB presented the first Rainbow Bridges Student Film Festival. This event showcased films made through the Rainbow Bridges program. The goal of the event was to raise awareness of the 2S LGBTQ+ resources available to schools, teachers, and students. The next film festival will be held in February. Visit our website to watch last week's event or learn more about submitting a film to the next festival. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge a letter received from Dr. Vera Etches on behalf of Ottawa Public Health and the community. The letter offers thanks to the work that each of our staff members does to keep our schools clean and safe. I could not agree with Dr. Etches more than when she writes, "You are providing a safe environment for our kids to learn, grow, and be meaningfully connected with others." We know that everyone working in schools has made the health, safety, and well-being of students their top priority, and we are witnessing that your efforts are truly making a difference. I too would like to extend my thanks to all staff, and I encourage you to take a few minutes to read the full letter on our website. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Director. And on behalf of all trustees, I would like to extend our thanks as well to all of our staff who've been working so hard to keep our students learning and to keep our schools clean and safe. Good job all around. Are there any questions for the director? And seeing none brings us to delegations. We have no delegations this evening. And that brings us in turn to our COVID-19 update. Madam Director.
Thank you, and through you, Madam Chair. Our current caseload as of 5 p.m. today, the OCDSB is reporting 36 active cases, students and staff, and 195 resolved cases. There are currently 2 closed classes in the OCDSB schools. Trustees had asked about the distribution of cases by grade. Ottawa Public Health will be releasing more data in a presentation to City Council this week, but based on the information they shared most recently, the distribution of cases seems relatively similar across grade levels. A new Ottawa Public Health video, OPH has released a new video to explain the process that is used to notify parents when someone at school tests positive for COVID-19 and how high-risk contacts are then identified. The video is posted to both the OPH website and the OCDSB website and has been shared with our parents. Update today from Dr. Etches to the local situation. Late this afternoon, Dr. Etches reached out to community partners to provide an update and request that we share information with our community. She noted that recent trends in Ottawa's COVID-19 data have been positive, though hospitalizations are stable, they are not yet declining. Further, wastewater data shows the level of COVID in the community may not be rapidly declining. However, this is not unexpected, given that previous experience shows a decline usually takes longer than a rapid rise. She also noted that Ottawa is currently in the orange or restrict zone in the newly released provincial COVID-19 response framework for keeping Ontario safe and open. Green means prevent, yellow means protect, orange is restrict, red control, and gray lockdown. She cautioned that we must remain diligent in our efforts to stay COVID-wise. In ongoing efforts to understand the types of settings and situations that have the most impact on COVID-19 transmission, OPH published a report on acquisition exposures of COVID-19, which provided an analysis of where people who have tested positive for COVID-19 may have been exposed to or were able to transmit the virus to others. The report identifies risk factors which align with what the World Health Organization has identified as the 3 C's, where COVID-19 spreads more easily, particularly when all 3 overlap. Crowded places with many people nearby, close contacts sitting or setting with close range conversations, and confined and enclosed spaces with poor ventilation. To help build community awareness, OPH has launched a 1 Million Reasons video campaign, which the district is also promoting. Dr. Etches also cautions about other harms to health, acknowledging that Ottawa residents are experiencing worsened mental health and emotional well-being. The OCDSB continues to work both within the organization and with partners in the community to increase awareness of mental health and addiction supports and resources to reduce stigma that prevents many from seeking out these supports. And again, we want to recognize and thank Dr. Vera Etches for the letter that she has sent to our educators, recognizing their work in ensuring a safe environment for students to return to school and to maintain schools being open. And so that's all for my report, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Madam Director. And we do have a question from Trustee Blackburn. Please go ahead, Trustee Blackburn.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and through you, and thank you to the director for her report. So what I heard you say is that the cases are spread throughout all the grades, and I know that within my own zone, there are cases in the grades lower than 3. So is there has the OPH talked about making masks mandatory in grades 3 and lower to keep the kids safer?
Thank you, Trustee Blackburn. I will turn the question to Associate Director Reynolds as he continues to sit at the OPH table as a part of the 4 boards OPH conversation for COVID. AD Reynolds.
Thank you, and thank you through you, Chair. No, not to date. They still see making mandatory mask wearing in grades K through 3 problematic in terms of the students not being able to doff and don their own masks reliably and practice safe mask usage. The executive officer has taken a closer look at the detail for our own district, and it does seem that there is not a disproportionate number of cases happening in the primary grades compared to grades 4 and up, where mask wearing is happening because of some of the extra practices that our staff are taking in those lower grades, K through 3. So no, it is not emerging as a need in Ottawa at this time.
Through you, Madam Chair, may I have a follow-up?
Yes, you may.
Thank you. So I didn't, yeah, so what I heard the director say was that the cases are spread out fairly evenly. So I'm aware that we have cases in grade 3 and under. And so I guess my question would be the cases that we do that are positive, and I have a school where there's multiple cases. Are we aware that if the positive cases, if those children were wearing masks or not, like, can we say that, oh no, masks don't matter, but they do for older kids? Like it doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but again, I'm not a medical professional. I just know what's happening in my own community, and I remain concerned about it.
So through you, Chair, if I may, we've had upwards of 220 or so positive cases in schools, but only about 6 of those are a result of transmission within the school, 6 or 7. So the mask is primarily used to prevent transmission to others, or if it's a medical grade mask preventing the receiving or breathing in and inhaling of droplets. Only out of those 200 and something cases, the students became infected, or staff, with COVID outside of the school. So with only 6 or 7 cases of transmission within the buildings, I think the risks of having staff handling and assisting students with their masks at the lower grades are probably greater, given that the vast majority of students who have been exposed to COVID are exposed outside of the school.
All right, very good, thank you.
Moving on then, I have a question from Trustee Bell.
Thank you very much. And through you, Chair, I was wondering if we could get an update on progress concerning the 3rd C. So do we have any updates when it comes to what we're doing to improve ventilation within the school system?
Madam Director?
Yeah, thank you, through you, Madam Chair. There have been a number of efforts made to address the continued ventilation improvement. We do have CFO Carson here, who's able to speak with more detail to that particular inquiry. CFO Carson.
Madam Chair, our staff are continuing the work that we had identified earlier in terms of monitoring the buildings that were in the type 3 category that we had discussed. The purchases of the portable air filtration systems are being directed at those schools first, and we will continue to work with schools as we identify opportunities to improve the situation. In schools that have ventilation, the measures we have in place have been successful. Things like purging the school before the building begins and more frequent air changes.
Trustee Bell?
That's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you. And Trustee Ellis has a question.
Yeah, on the follow-up on the ventilation question, have we been tracking where we're seeing, I mean, it's very small that's transmitted in our schools. I'm just wondering, will we be using this data to take a look to see if ventilation did actually play a role in transmission of COVID?
Madam Chair, our staff are involved when Ottawa Public Health has identified that issue at a school, that there is a positive case. Our staff do review the ventilation systems there to see if there is any possibility that a malfunction contributed to it. But as we've said before, the air-to-air transmission does not seem to have been significant, but it is something that our staff look at when we're involved by OPH and by the principal.
I raise this. I hope the province will take a comprehensive look at this. I'm thinking as we come out of COVID, if there's a direct correlation, if we can show that ventilation was an issue, it might give us a little more evidence for and support in asking for funds to modernize our HVAC systems. Thanks.
Thank you, Trustee Ellis. And I have no one else on my list with a question. So that brings us on to matters for action, beginning with confirmation of the board minutes from the 27th of October, 2020. Do we have a mover for those minutes for confirmation? Trustee Huff, seconded by? Trustee Blackburn, are you seconding that? Can't hear you.
Yes.
Thank you. Are there any errors or omissions in the minutes from the 27th of October? Seeing none, I will call the question then on confirmation of the minutes. All those in favor? And opposed? And the minutes are confirmed. Next, we have the confirmation of the minutes of our special board meeting from the 16th of November, 2020. Would someone like to move those? Trustee Boothby, seconded by Trustee Jenkins. Are there any errors or omissions in these minutes? Trustee Ellis?
Yes, thank you. On folio 25, the last paragraph, it indicates that Trustee Blackburn gave introduction. I believe Trustee Campbell gave introduction.
I'm not sure which page you're on because I'm looking at the HTML version. So there are six pages in the report altogether.
Second page.
So it's the second page.
Last paragraph.
Last paragraph.
It says in introducing the motion, Trustee Blackburn made the following statements.
That's
I don't
correct.
believe it wasn't introduction.
You're correct. So we will ask for that correction to be made. Anything further?
Yes. On folio 26, page 3 of the report, the first paragraph after the bullets.
Yes.
Trustee Ellis registered a concern that the investigation report was not independently discussed as had been past practice. I was making the point that in previous code of conduct, we were restricted to, at the first part, just to speak for clarification to the investigator's report, and that in this instance, that had been changed.
Thank you for that. Anything further?
Yes. On folio 27, second paragraph, it speaks, this is student trustee Louise's comments. She raised the concern that sanctioning a trustee for raising systemic racism at the board could have a chilling effect on future trustees bringing forward systemic racism. I don't think that was captured. I think it's important to, because if trustee Louis hadn't brought that point up, I would have.
Thank you for that.
And my final one, folio 28. Which would be page 5, I guess. Second last paragraph reads, trustee Ellis inquired whether investigator Traynor had examined if there had been a history of vexatious, and I would insert code of, then conduct at the board. Strike out between the trustees. I was raising because there had been, because I'm aware of code of conducts against me that had been dismissed as vexatious, and so it wasn't between the two trustees. It was a history of vexatious code of conduct at the board was my point there.
Thank you very much, trustee Ellis.
Thank you.
I am assuming that staff have captured all of those corrections, and I will add one more, which I noticed as I was looking at the report, and that is, could you please ensure that student trustee Liu's name is correctly spelled? Any further errors or omissions for the minutes from the 16th of November? If not, then I will call the question on the minutes with those amendments incorporated. All those in favor? And opposed? And the motion is carried. Is there any business arising from either set of board minutes? Seeing none, that brings us to receipt of the Committee of the Whole minutes from the 10th of November, 2020. Vice Chair Penny.
Hello, I'd like to move receipt of the Committee of the Whole minutes from November the 10th.
And do we have a seconder for that motion? Trustee Fisher? Are there any errors or omissions in the report from Committee of the Whole from the 10th of November? Seeing none, I'll call the question on receipt. All those in favor? And opposed? And the motion to receive is carried. Report from the committee, Mr. Vice Chair.
It doesn't appear that there was no business arising out of that report.
No recommendations?
There was no recommendations from that. There was 2 in-camera recommendations, if you recall.
And those have been dealt with.
Yeah.
So that concludes your report then.
Yes, it does, Madam Chair.
And next we have item 8.4, the report from the Audit Committee from the 21st of October. In this instance, we did in fact receive this report already, but at the time that we received it, we unfortunately omitted to deal with the 3 recommendations that were in the report. So I would like to go to the chair of the Audit Committee, Trustee Fisher, to present the recommendations, please.
Thanks, Madam Chair. As you indicated, we had 3 recommendations arising from the Audit Committee meeting 21st October 2020. And I'm assuming Nicole will put these up. The first recommendation is the approval of the 2019-2020 annual report on internal audit activity, which was moved by Trustee Penny, which I will second. And the recommendation reads as follows: that the Appendix A to Report 20-074 be approved as the 2019-2020 annual report on internal audit activity.
And I will ask if this is a consent item. And if it is not a consent item, please raise your hand. And I'm not seeing any hands raised, so I'm assuming that will be a consent item. Let us move on then to the next recommendation from the Audit Committee.
Thanks, Madam Chair. So the second recommendation is the approval of the Audit Committee annual report. It was originally moved by one of our external members, Annick Blanchard, so we'll need a substitute mover.
And who would like to serve as substitute mover for that? Trustee Penny, thank you.
And I will second the recommendation, which reads that report 20-075 be approved as the Audit Committee annual report to the board for 2019-2020.
Thank you, Trustee Fisher. Is this a consent item? And again, I will ask you, if it is not consent, raise your hand to signify that. And I don't see any hands, so that one will also be a consent item. And I believe you have one more recommendation, Trustee Fisher.
That's correct, Madam Chair. So the approval of the 2020-2021 internal audit plan, again, which was originally moved by Annick Blanchard, one of our external members. So we'll need a mover and substitute.
And again, Trustee Schwartz will substitute.
And I will second. And the recommendation reads as follows: that the Ottawa-Carleton District School Board Audit Committee recommends for approval the 2020-2021 internal audit plan as presented in Appendix 1.
Thank you very much for that. Is that a consent item? And I see no one raising a hand to signify non-consent. So we will deal with all three of these recommendations from the Audit Committee in a single recorded vote. And I will ask Manager Guthrie, please, to conduct the vote.
Trustee Boothby,
In favor.
Trustee Blackburn,
In favor?
Trustee Huff,
In favor?
Trustee Campbell,
In favor.
Trustee Ellis,
In favor?
Trustee Jennekins,
In favor.
Trustee Penny,
In favor?
Trustee Lyra,
In favor.
Trustee Bell,
In favor?
Trustee Fisher,
In favor?
Trustee Schwartz,
In favor.
Trustee Scott,
In favor.
and that is 12 in favor.
Thank you. So the motion is carried unanimously. Thank you very much, Trustee Fisher, for helping us tidy up the matter of those recommendations. Next up, we have item 8.5. This one will be an oral report from the Audit Committee meeting of the 23rd of November, 2020. And I will go back to Trustee Fisher.
Thanks, Madam Chair. The Audit Committee met last night and reports and recommends as follows. The approval of the 2019-2020 consolidated financial statements, which was moved by external member Eric Husband. So we'll need a substitute mover in this case as well.
And do we have a substitute mover? Trustee Schwartz, thank you.
Thank you, and I'll second. And the recommendation reads as follows: that the draft 2019-2020 consolidated financial statements attached as Appendix A to Report 20-092 be approved.
And is this a consent item?
Chair, I have a question, if I may.
Trustee Ellis?
I may have missed it, but were the draft consolidated financials part of the, have been sent to trustees? Was it in the audit?
They were all attached to the Public Audit Committee agenda
Okay, thank you.
and provided in e-scribe to trustees and posted on the board website.
Thank you.
So again, I will ask if this is a consent.
Madam Chair, if it's
item.
helpful,
Trustee Fisher?
no, I was just going to say, Madam Chair, if it's helpful, just in case some trustees didn't have an opportunity to review the financial statements, because I realized the committee meeting was last night. Perhaps the CFO could provide a brief overview to give trustees a comfort level before voting on the item. But happy to move straight to the vote if that's.
I think that's an excellent suggestion. And not only do we have CFO Carson here with us this evening, but we also have representatives of our external auditors, KPMG, specifically Mr. Rob Clayton. So I will go to CFO Carson for a brief overview.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and I will keep my comments brief. The financial statements, the consolidated financial statements were presented to Audit Committee last night and were reviewed. There are a couple of reports that were provided, one with the details of the consolidated statements and a second report that identified the analysis. In short, we recorded a deficit of approximately $2.6 million for the year ended August 31st, 2020. That is about $6 million less than we had budgeted for. That number is based on the compliance basis of accounting. It is the basis the ministry uses when it's evaluating our financial statements and our comparison to a budget. The consolidated financial statements are compiled on a slightly different basis. And under that basis of accounting, we saw a surplus of approximately $11 million. The difference are a number of non-cash transactions and changes in timing with respect to capital. So I think we could say that we were successful in keeping the deficit lower than we had budgeted. And the expenditures for 2019 also included approximately $7 million of expenses that were incurred to help support us through COVID during the period of March to June, and more importantly, to help get us prepared for the opening of schools. So that included expenditures for things like PPE before the ministry identified they would be supplying it, the shields and barriers that you've seen on students' desks, the acrylic barriers that we've created in offices, and that sort of information, as well as the additional IT purchases that were made to support distance learning. So I think, Madam Chair, from an operational point of view, the financial year was relatively successful. The deficit was smaller than we had anticipated, and it does provide us with more flexibility going forward. Having said that, Madam Chair, I think I'll turn it over to Mr. Clayton now from KPMG, and he can talk about the auditor's report.
Mr. Clayton.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And through you, Chair, I would like to say that we're happy to be here today to discuss our auditor's reports that you would have seen attached to the consolidated financial statements. And that report does note that the accompanying financial statements present fairly in all material respects the consolidated financial position of the entity as at August 31st, 2020, its consolidated results of operations, changes in net debt and consolidated cash flows for the year then ended in accordance with the basis of accounting described in the notes to the financial statements, which is what is the required basis as utilized by the Ministry of Education in Ontario. And I'm also happy to report that we did receive full cooperation from the board, and our audit did not identify any significant concerns or weaknesses that we needed to bring to the attention of management or the audit committee.
Thank you very much for being here this evening and for sharing that information with us. Are there any questions for CFO Carson or for Mr. Clayton? Trustee Lyra.
So based on what you have said, we have gotten a smaller deficit than was anticipated. I'm wondering where the money is being saved, and if it's in staff or if it's in projects we're not completing. How is the decision to not complete those projects made?
Madam Chair, in 2019, 2020, much of the savings were in areas like transportation, since we were working remotely. Some of the other areas where we had estimated costs that weren't fulfilled, things like professional development, and a number of areas that we were unable to proceed with due to the closure. As always in the financial statements, there's a number of areas of under and over expenditures. The under expenditures crossed a number of areas on the instructional lines once we were out of the buildings. We also saw decreases in things like some of our utility costs where we were able, when the buildings were empty.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Lyra. And I see no further questions. So I think we've already moved this one out of being a consent item or a non-consent item, and it's the last item before we get to non-consent items anyway. So I think we might as well proceed to call the question on this. Again, this will be a recorded vote, and I will ask Manager Guthrie, please, to conduct the vote.
Trustee Boothby.
In favor.
Trustee Blackburn.
In favor.
Trustee Huff.
In favor.
Trustee Campbell.
In favor.
Trustee Ellis.
Abstain.
Trustee Jennekins.
In favor.
Trustee Penny.
In favor.
Trustee Lyra.
In favor.
Trustee Bell.
In favor.
Trustee Fisher.
In favor.
Trustee Schwartz.
In favor.
Trustee Scott.
In favor.
That is 11 in favor, 1 abstention.
So the motion is carried, and I will say thank you again to all of the members of our audit committee for working through this carefully last evening, and appreciation again to CFO Carson and to Mr. Clayton from KPMG. And I would also note that last night was the last meeting for our 2 external volunteer members of the audit committee, Mr. Eric Husband and Ms. Annick Blanchard. And we thank them very much for their service as members of the audit committee for this past number of years. Moving on then to the next item on our agenda. Since we have no other items that would fall potentially under non-consent, 8.7 deals with report 20-089, appointment of the Learning Disabilities Association of Ottawa alternate representative to the Special Education Advisory Committee. And I will go to Executive Officer Giroux to present the report.
Madam Chair, the report is in your package. As you've noted, we're looking to appoint an alternate rep for the Learning Disabilities Association of Ottawa-Carleton to SEAC. The term is the 24th of November to the 2020 to 14 November 2022. We have reviewed all of the requirements and are recommending that Marianne Long be appointed as the alternate member for LDAO.
Thank you for that report. The floor is open. There is a recommendation in the report. Trustee Boothby.
Thank you, Chair. I'll move the recommendation and welcome an alternate around the SEAC table. And I'd also like to thank Michael Bates for his years of being not only the alternate, but at one point he was the member for LDAO.
Thank you, Trustee Boothby. Is there a seconder for that motion? Trustee Ellis, you're seconding?
Yes, I am.
Thank you. Is there any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, any wrap-up required, Trustee Boothby?
Just to thank Marianne Long for putting her name forward.
Absolutely. SEAC wouldn't run without good volunteers. I will ask Manager Guthrie then to conduct a recorded vote.
Trustee Boothby,
In favor.
Trustee Blackburn,
In favor?
Trustee Huff,
In favor?
Trustee Campbell,
In favor.
Trustee Ellis,
In favor?
Trustee Jennings,
In favor.
Trustee Penny,
In favor?
Trustee Lyra,
In favor.
Trustee Bell,
In favor.
Trustee Fisher,
In favor.
Trustee Schwartz,
In favor.
Trustee Scott.
In favor.
That is 12 in favor, Madam Chair.
So the motion is carried unanimously. Thank you very much for that. And that brings us then to matters for discussion. At our committee of the whole meeting, we found that we really didn't have a lot of time for our discussion and opportunity to ask questions about the annual report on student suspensions. There was an interest in bringing this item back, and we have done so this evening. It would be appropriate if someone wished to ask to adopt rules of committee. Otherwise, the board rules will apply and speakers will only have the opportunity to speak once for up to 5 minutes. Trustee Campbell.
Move to adopt rules of committee.
And is there a seconder for that? Trustee Boothby will second that. I will call the question on adopting rules of committee. All those in favor? And those opposed? And that means we are in rules of committee, and people will be allowed to speak for up to 3 minutes, but may speak more than once to the item. We are just at roughly 10 to 8, and we do have a further significant report to discuss as well. So I would ask people to keep that in mind. And
Can I
Trustee-
introduction? Can I introduce?
Madam Director, would you like to make a brief refresher introduction for us?
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair, and thank you for that indulgence. Yes, we did learn a lot from the brief conversation that happened the last time we brought this report, and we appreciate the opportunity to bring it back again. Superintendent Farish does have a couple of introductory comments and has some additional resources to support the conversation today to ensure that trustees have a fulsome opportunity to understand not only what we've learned, but what the possibilities are going forward. So Superintendent Farish, please.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I just wanted to confirm that you can see the slide that I have shared.
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Okay. I did organize the opening remarks here in 6 slides. So I promise to be brief. So what we wanted to do, as Director Williams Taylor mentioned, was really try to frame this conversation or allow for you to frame your conversation this evening with some of the learnings that we took back from our past discussion at POW. So we know that we need to consider who our students are. Their identities matter, and identities can be contextual, as we know. And so in an intentional way to unlearn and relearn our engagement strategies, we need to be looking at how we use progressive discipline and the responses that we make. And we know that our progressive discipline responses have led us to the results that you've seen documented in the suspension rates from the report. And this is not learning for us that is about fixing students, of course. It's about confronting and addressing our own practices and the systems that are not serving all of our students. And we need to be introspective and ask ourselves, what are the choices we can make, that we need to make, that will positively impact engagement and sense of belonging for students? These choices will demonstrate the central importance of identity in our decision-making processes. Our decisions impact our relationships with students. We need to connect how our school-level obligation to use our discretionary authority must engage, empower, and elevate students. And it needs to reflect the relationships we want and the relationships we know that are foundational for learning, for student achievement and well-being, and for general safety and student success. So what are our next, whoops, got ahead of myself. What are our next steps when we talk about creating the conditions for learning and for student success? We are committed to shifting the narrative so that we are focusing not on student behaviors, but in fact on the conditions that we are creating for learning and for working in our schools. We need to focus on the context to reveal the variables and the factors that contribute to or tell the stories of what we are seeing in ways that the students are engaging. We need a clearer understanding of the data. Students who self-identify as Indigenous, Black, Middle Eastern, as boys, students with special education profiles, and students who are English language learners, students who have gender diversity, and students residing in lower income neighborhoods. They are all more likely to be suspended. And we need to ask ourselves what the research is telling us, what we already know, and ensure that our staff in our schools are familiar with the foundational research and the research that includes narrative voices and own voices. So these are just some of the examples of what we are doing and where we are going. We know that collaboration is definitely the way forward here, and we are beginning to formalize multi-departmental approaches so that the work is integrated and yet also explicit in our leadership in the areas of program and learning, innovation and adolescent learning, research evaluation and analysis, in learning support services, safe schools, of course, business and learning technologies, in Indigenous education, in equity, and in our human rights division work. And so our PD is looking like school and district staff PD in Indigenous knowledge, in diversity and inclusion fundamentals, and learning more about unconscious bias. We're also going to be learning more about anti-racism, anti-oppression, and human rights. We're looking at PD for bias-free progressive discipline, which centers identity and employs alternatives to suspension. And PD for our early years teams in kindergarten and the primary grades, so that we're creating positive and supportive learning environments that again center student identity and the factors that may impact the students' ways of being in their classrooms, so that we're understanding implicit bias in traumatic experiences. We're also looking at implementing a framework or an approach for staff called the third path, which is again about creating the conditions for a sense of belonging, physical and emotional safety, and a path or an approach that incorporates the importance of of identity. We are also, as you well know, we also have introduced Indigenous and Black graduation coaches at specific sites, and those coaches promote and support student success and pathways to graduation to assist, and they also assist in identifying and addressing the systemic barriers that are getting in the way, such as progressive discipline responses. We are also looking at expanding community partnerships with organizations that support and promote programs in schools, specifically for Indigenous, Black students with special education profiles, for boys, students who are minoritized, and students who are living in lower income communities. We are also redesigning course content in certain areas such as social studies, history, and geography, and as well in the grades 9 to 12 English curriculum. And we are looking to expand our leadership and networking opportunities for Indigenous, Black, and minoritized youth in order to inform our district programs and practices. And of course, we have some very promising practices happening now. These come from our school sites, specific school sites, as they are reviewing their use of progressive discipline, their decisions that they make, and the practices that they influence in their classrooms and at the school level. And we are very happy to be able to have a few administrators with us as special guests this evening. We do have our assistant principal for Safe Schools, Colin Anderson, is with us. We have Principal Kristen Copra, who is from Hawthorne Public School. We have Vice Principal Andrew Cumberland from Ottawa Technical Secondary School. And we also have Manager Dr. Petra Duschner here as well for to offer insights. And of course, Manager Joan Worocheski is with us as well. That concludes my brief presentation.
Thank you very much for doing that, Superintendent Farish. And thank you as well for making sure that was organized, because that I'm sure will be helpful to us as we proceed. I have a growing list of people here, beginning with Trustee Campbell, and I am setting a timer.
Want me to time it, Madam Chair?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and please put me back on the list. So I'll start off. So first of all, thank you to staff for the update. Some of the actions that the superintendent listed for us weren't that I could easily map anyway in the next steps portion of the report that was presented to us. So should I take it that the set of official next steps is going to be expanded beyond what those which we see in the report?
Go ahead. Through you, Madam Chair. Yes, Trustee Campbell, I would say to you that indeed that would be what you saw as next steps would be including but not limited to. Trustee Campbell, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Trustee Campbell.
Yep, thank you very much. So that's helpful because, yeah, when I look on, I guess what I see is page 6 and 7, especially not the data next steps, but the, addressing next steps. There isn't really a whole lot there. This is a lot of the items that were discussed here. Can I ask, and it may have been the intention in the updated presentation, but from the minutes last time when we were engaged in this discussion, and it's my recall as well, staff suggested or agreed that performing an audit of existing progressive discipline practices across schools would be something that would be considered. And I guess what I'm wondering is, and perhaps that, as I recall, that how this kind of thing is dealt with might be part of school admin performance reviews. So are those items meant to be captured by some of the updated items we've been presented with this evening, or would those be yet a third set of possible actions that may not yet actually form part of the next steps set?
Through you, Madam Chair, I turn the question to Superintendent Farish.
Thank you very much, Director Williams-Taylor, and through you, Madam Chair. So that particular action in terms of an audit of school progressive discipline practices was not one of the items that was captured in the update. You're correct that I just provided. I think when we heard that last time, we need to think a little bit about how we might structure that and how it might fit into some of the ways that we already do reviews, certainly with schools as superintendents of instruction when we work with school admin teams to review how their school improvement planning, their student achievement, well-being is all factored into their leadership. And school and progressive discipline is part and parcel because it actually reflects student engagement and it reflects the conditions for learning. So that the structure of an actual audit of practices across the district is something that we haven't yet discussed as an independent action, but you can be assured that all of the superintendents of instruction have been very much engaged in looking at the data and making some next steps in terms of how we are going to engage with our admin teams in our schools to interrogate the school level data as well.
Whoops, which is a form of informal audit, I guess, in a sense, an investigation into each school's practices. Because I think I wasn't the only one. I think a number of trustees mentioned their concern about possible lack of consistency across schools and how that might be important to improve. That's my recall from last time, and I think it's reflected in the minutes as well. Do I have much time left, Madam Chair, or?
25 seconds.
25 seconds. Okay, because the clock I see on the screen is very different. It gives me 2 minutes, 30 seconds. Okay. I'm not going to be able to achieve much in 20 seconds. Please put me back on the list.
I will do that. And move on to student trustee Liu.
Thank you. So my question for staff is there a framework that school administrations reference in order to apply like progressive discipline, or any type of framework that they can reference in order to determine where discretionary suspension should be used? Is it that, or is it more so just kind of to the judgment of the school administration?
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair. The short answer is yes, there is a framework, and I will turn it to Superintendent Farish to briefly give a synopsis of what that looks like.
Thank you very much, Director. And in fact, this might be a great opportunity to introduce one of my colleagues here to share that answer with you, Trustee Louis. I'm thinking System Principal Colin Anderson might have the most succinct response to your question.
Thank you, Superintendent Farish, and through you, Madam Chair. There is a framework for school administration to follow when considering a suspension. A couple of years ago, a template guiding them through the steps of reviewing incidents, reviewing progressive discipline history, reviewing mitigating and other factors involved, the communication steps, and so on, was developed, and all schools have been using that since last year in terms of their considerations around applying suspensions.
Thank you. And actually, could I ask you to elaborate a bit more on what that framework is? Is it kind of like this does it outline this is the severity of the type of behavior and this is the corresponding like type of discipline that we're using? Would you mind elaborating and being just sort of help enlightening us to the specifics or some of these specifics?
Certainly. I'm not entirely sure how to answer that question in terms of the severity. The list of potential choices under our policy and procedures are part of that. It's a back-to-back single-page document, and on the back there's all the potential suspensions, and they are identified as either discretionary or mandatory. And in terms of guidance on the term of a suspension, that's up to a principal's judgment, except the mandatory, where they would work with their superintendent on a decision around the more severe consequences.
Thank you. So, oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to interject there, Madam Chair. One of the things that it's really important to highlight when we're having a conversation about these kinds of decisions is that context and conditions and circumstances all play into informing the judgment around what the outcomes for the discipline is. And the reason it is talked about as progressive is the fact that one of the things that is considered is the nature of previous conversations and whether or not, in fact, it's not always that it is a suspension, that there are different kinds of disciplinary outcomes that can be applied. And so it's very important to consider this is not an algorithmic kind of approach, that if this happens, this is going to be the outcome, that it's really expected, particularly as we look at some of the conditions and the realities that Superintendent Farish identified, that principals weigh some of those factors in making decisions around discipline that in fact is not punitive, but is restorative and corrective and educative. And that's something that is a very key nuance to really speak to, because a lot of times people think that it is a discipline is supposed to be punitive, and that is not the case.
Thank you. So, so the idea that I'm getting here is that we shouldn't be sort of having a standard policy, like assessing behavior or using any type of algorithmic approach, because that sort of, doesn't factor in, inequities. It doesn't factor in the context for like these situations. Thanks. Okay, great. Thank you. Because I had a follow-up question, second question, but I think actually your answers have helped me sort of address that. And I also just wanted to add also thank you for really bringing in the holistic approach, like things about like graduation coaches and like inclusive curriculum, because I do agree that those are really important to, to sort of reducing the types of inequitable, like the inequities we're seeing with suspensions right now. All right, thank you.
Thank you, student trustee Liu. And that brings me to trustee Ellis as our next speaker.
Thank you. In the past, on these suspensions, it was evident that there was not really a consistent categorizing of this, so it was very hard for us to try and figure out what suspensions, what was going on with our suspensions. Is this being addressed as we move forward, the categorizing and standardizing, so that we have a little more consistency?
Through you, Madam Chair, I'll ask Superintendent Farish to address the question.
Thank you, Director Williams-Taylor, and through you, Madam Chair. If I understand the question correctly, I'm wondering if it speaks more to the way that we're reporting on the data and the way that you would like to see the data categorized in that format, as opposed to the decisions that we're making in progressive discipline responses around that, the corrective restorative pieces. Are you talking, Trustee Ellis, more about how it's reported on in the actual document that you receive?
Yeah, in the past, it's about suspension. It's not the restorative, because that hopefully restorative discipline or whatever, doesn't, when it rises to the level of suspension, there's listings of why, and overwhelmingly, I think it was not good climate or at the school climate or something. It really didn't. There was no consistency, and it was always this, that, and changing every year. So I'm just wondering, or are we just going to throw that out as not really being relevant to this? I'm just wondering where we are on that particular issue and where we're going to be going with it in the future.
So I'll try to answer that question, but I also see that we have some support here through Manager Giroux or Executive Officer Giroux, pardon me. So those categories, actually, I think that you're referring to those categories are the actual list of categories that we choose from when we make a decision to suspend. So there are sections within the Education Act that provide guidance around a response where if we're considering suspension, and in some cases we can consider or shall consider, and in other cases we must consider. And so then the categories that we have, some of them are through mandated to us through the Ed Act, the other legislative pieces that are connected, and some of them are categories or terminology, let's say that way, that we have assigned through our own policies and procedures at the OCDSB. So I think that you'd continue to see the categories that you do, but perhaps you would prefer to see different cross tabulations, or you'd like to see ones highlighted and other ones maybe aren't as significant.
Yeah, just my point is that in the past, they were not helpful at all in when the data came back, because it was obvious there's no consistency. Anyways, moving on from there. We started, this one is sort of the first one where we've got some racialized and socioeconomic around our suspensions. But we've had at this board for quite a long time our spec ed. And we saw that there was more suspensions. You were more likely to be suspended. Generally the board suspension rate was about 2%, but if you had an IEP, it was around 6%. You were likely to be suspended, and even higher in certain exceptionalities. So, it's great that we're going to be expanding and trying to get more nuance and greater understanding about who's being suspended. But really, I'm wondering what, we have next steps. And the next steps that I think we're all wanting to get to is, how do we intervene prior to a suspension being that last? And, in the spec ed, because I've been following it for quite a few years and not seeing any change, I'm seized with it. In the spec ed, there is opportunity for mitigating factors for these students. And I'm wondering why that's not happening more, and we're not seeing a decline in, that percentage of spec ed students coming down. So just a quick comment on what we're going to be the indicators we're having success in this. And thank you. That's my last question.
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair. Superintendent Simmons is prepared to respond to the question raised by the trustee.
Thank you, Director and Chair, through you. So as Superintendent Farish has mentioned at the beginning, we're taking a very close look at factors related to engagement and attachment for our children, our students, to help have them in class and behaving in ways that are allowing them to stay in class. We are also exploring, we're well on our way along the line of exploring the third path, which takes a relationship-based approach to student engagement and student achievement. So we have established a steering committee just to help explore ways as we collaborate with Dr. David Tranter. You may recall he's the gentleman who provided videos for parents, staff, and did a webinar in August leading back to the return to school. So we're collaborating with David Tranter around the third path and seeking out ways that we can embed that as practice in each of our schools moving forward to build that sense of engagement. Thinking there that the more we can have students engaged, the less likely we're to see behaviors that we'll see the need for suspension. We also are continuing to work on supports for staff to support the mental health and well-being of students in our classrooms. And I know Dr. Duschner's team has been very closely involved with much of that work to help inform some of the practices that are going on. You highlighted, some exceptionalities are more stand out more as receiving more higher levels of suspensions. And we do work very closely with our mental health team to support students in our behavior intervention programs, for example. So I don't know if that provides a little bit of where we're at. There's more details that I could provide if it would be helpful.
I'm anticipating that the suspension report will be coming to SEAC, so I'll go into more detail on that there. Thank you.
Did you wish to be back on the list a second time, Trustee Ellis?
Not at this point. I don't have any on my, not saying I won't.
And I will ask that people who've already spoken, please take their hands down. If you have asked to be on the list for a second time, I have you on my list. Moving on then to Trustee Bell.
First, I want to thank Chair for bringing this back on the agenda, and also thank you, Superintendent Farish, for that presentation at the beginning of our conversation. I have a couple questions. The first one is really, I guess it's a question to staff, whether we could get a memo on progressive discipline, because I'm doing my best to really understand what it is and what are some of the initiatives that would take place as the progressive discipline moved forward. And I still don't quite get it. I can think back to my own circumstances when there were disruptive behaviors in my daughter's class. The LSS was then called, and then an assessment and advice and support was given to the teachers to help improve the situation. But I don't know if that's what happens in many of these cases. So if we could get a comment on that, and maybe the possibility of a memo down the line explaining this a bit further. And then I also wanted to know currently if this is the result of behaviors, and we're seeing increased behaviors right now because of certain constraints that are put on, let's say recess time, or kids not being able to run around as much as before and being confined to certain spaces. What are we, what are our interventions right now in response to that? And I guess that does go down the line to, especially for the younger grades, are there IEPs going into place? And I know that those are a lot of questions that probably could be answered in a memo, but if somebody could give me a comment right now, it'd be appreciated.
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair. I'll give a brief answer to the first question about can there be a memo to outline what progressive discipline looks like, and the answer is yes. The second piece, I'll turn to Principal Kristen Copra, who is indeed a principal on the ground with our students, who's able to respond to some of the issues pertaining to responding to challenging behaviors that are a result of challenging conditions. Principal Copra. You're still muted. Could you unmute, please? Thank you.
Sorry, thank you, Director. You would think I had that figured out 8 months into a COVID pandemic, but here we are. Thank you very much. So in terms of, I guess, what I see right now with COVID and what we're seeing in terms of particular interventions, I want to put out there that the talk has come up about restorative practices. And I think it's important that we recognize that restorative practices isn't getting a couple of kids together after a situation has happened as an alternative solely to suspension. It's an entire approach towards viewing community and viewing behaviors within that community. And so when we're talking right now, yes, we are seeing some stress behaviors start to come out, particularly around COVID. But I think really the best practices that we have at all times are those same practices that we are trying to employ. So, you know, if we truly believe in belonging, I would argue that discretionary suspensions, particularly at an elementary level, I'll be honest with you, at a K-8 school, most of those suspensions are ones that we have to consider, but are not musts. And so, you know, we have many different options towards us. So the restorative practices is just, again, it's not a program. It's not something that we put in after the fact, but it's really a whole way to approaching community. That requires a culture shift, right? And so it really requires us, again, this is heart work. This isn't reading a book or listening to a webinar and we've got it. It's partly that, but it's also heart work. And it's, if I cannot, you know, we've at Hawthorne, we had a community conversation about anti-Black racism back in June. And it very much pertains to this whole conversation around suspension. It pertains to the conversation around relationships. If I can't sit in community with you, how can I trust you? And I think that gets to the core of whether or not it's COVID time or not. What we do when kids exhibit behaviors that, to be honest, are problematic because of the structures we have set up, really. And so how can we value each kid where they're at in trying to get to the individuality of what they need? And many, you know, Superintendent Simmons, and Superintendent Farish both spoke to this extensively, but, you know, restorative as sort of that overarching piece. There are many other things that we do to support kids, and behaviors are showing us that we need to change something to better meet these needs. So whether or not that's ensuring that trauma is adequately addressed, and we've got lots of different ways that we do that, both within the board and with community partners, that we are honoring community connections and those pieces with our families. Very telling, that community conversation that we had that raised a lot of things, and a lot of them were, to be quite honest, things that lead us to the point of considering suspension. But really, for me, the more interesting place that we need to be looking is upstream. How are we having these places that have pull factors for kids, that we're decreasing those behaviors because of colonial and historic structures that we still have in place, really? Alternate, I could name some other specific things that we're doing. I don't know if that addresses it or not. I don't want to. I can talk.
Thank you, Principal Coper. I think you've been very illuminating. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. And through you, Chair, the next question that I have is, I am assuming that we also have the statistics of suspensions broken down by schools. And so we have, I'm assuming that there are higher numbers in certain schools than in other schools. Correct me if I'm wrong. And so with that information, I understand that there's PD, but is there principal directed anti-racism training? Is there principal directed implicit bias training as well, if those are the points that are, if those are the people that are making the decisions about suspensions?
Madam Director.
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair. Indeed, when we talk about data, and you would have seen the slide that Superintendent Farish put up on the screen that talked about being granular in looking at the data, we do look at how it is that each school is performing, and the principal and the school leaders are in fact committed to addressing the specific needs. We are not in the business of making comparisons. Our goal is to ensure that each school owns their own data and is in fact committed to moving that data along as it pertains to their own context. Is there indeed principal directed professional learning? Indeed there is. Many of our principals and our school leaders have in fact engaged in a number of different kinds of professional learning structures right in their local scenarios that are based on the needs of their staff, as well as the needs of their students and the directions that they undertake. And there has also been superintendency led professional learning, where superintendents have led professional learning for their principals on these matters to move the data along.
Trustee Bell?
I got a thumbs up.
Got a thumbs up. Thank you.
Thank you. Moving on to Trustee Lyra.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right. So this report filled me with multiple feelings. I'm ecstatic. I'm so happy that we are beginning to have this conversation, to talk about this and to build this report along intersectional data lines. But the numbers that have come back have made me livid. They've made me so upset. It breaks my heart that we have almost two times as many Black students or ESL students, 3.5 times as many Indigenous students, and more than 10 times as many students suffering from addictions who get suspensions. I think we have done ourselves a disservice as a district by not naming the role that school discipline plays in the school to prison pipeline. And I would like to know from staff or the director why we made the decision not to include it in this report, and if it was included in the conversation.
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair. I don't believe that it was an active decision not to include that information in the report. Our focus and our commitment was looking at the data as it pertains to our district and as it pertains to our practice. The notion of the school to prison pipeline is certainly something that has been identified in research and is borne out by some of the practices, but to attribute it to a singular school or a singular district is getting to the point of granularity that I don't believe the research intends. So I think that a part of the goal, and we have communicated this to the system, is that when we're looking at the identity-based data and making the intersections around the impact of certain decisions by the district or by classrooms or by schools, the goal there is to take ownership for outcomes, but not an intention to lay blame. And so I think that when we take ownership, we are in a position to move forward. When we start to lay blame, that is a counterproductive approach. So again, it wasn't an explicit decision to exclude a conversation that has been spoken about in research, but we felt that we were focused on what is pertinent pertaining to the question that we were asked around the how is it that the intersection of identity is reflected in data pertaining to discipline, to school discipline.
I suppose in my eyes, those two things are intricately linked, and that we as a district need to, like you said, be accountable for the outcomes in our area. And I believe that every district needs to work together or do the best that they can to address the outcomes of the school to prison pipeline. I have a follow-up specific question. On page 5, it says the majority of suspensions lasting 6 days or more were of a mandatory nature. Majority is kind of a funny word. It can mean 55% and it can mean 95%. And I'm wondering if you could tell me which of those numbers it's closer to. Are we talking about a little bit more than half, or are we talking about a vast majority?
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair. I'll turn the question to Superintendent Farish.
Thank you, Director Williams-Taylor. In fact, I think if there's somebody here who has an answer to that specific question, it would potentially be System Principal Colin Anderson, or it might also come through Reed, but I'm not sure if we have a we have representation from Reed to get that exact number for you, Trustee Lyra. I can certainly bring that back to you.
I believe that AD Reynolds is raising his hand to respond to the question.
Thank you, and through you, Chair, and maybe Reed has a better answer, but taking a look at the report and some of the data that supported it, it seemed that the majority of the reasons for the longer term suspensions did fall under the must suspend or consider principal's investigation than not. So when I don't have the hard number in my head, Trustee Lyra, but I'd say it's 75% or better. I'm guessing.
Mm-hmm.
Very rarely do we have a 1 to 5 day suspension for something that is not on that list.
So in Appendix A to the report, there is a section on mandatory versus discretionary suspensions. 10% of suspensions issued were mandatory in nature, 230 of 2,374. Slightly higher rate in elementary as compared to secondary.
So my question was specifically about the suspensions lasting more than 6 days.
Yes.
And so I didn't find information in any of the appendices about how often we optionally suspended a student for more than a school week. And that was the information I was seeking. I don't need it right now if you don't have the numbers. I look forward to hearing back from Superintendent Farish. Those were all of my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Lyra. Next, I have Trustee Blackburn.
Thank you, Chair, and through you, and thank you to staff for the report. My comments are in relation to students who access learning support services and the suspension rates of students with IEPs. My concern is that because we don't have enough resources for these students, we're not in a position to do a lot of prevention that we could be doing if we weren't. And this is, you know, I appreciate that the director mentioned that we're not into blaming here, but I think that anybody who listens to this, particularly our administrators, will perceive that we are in fact doing that. And so in that vein, I would ask that the Board of Trustees take responsibility for our part in this. And as a Board of Trustees, we insist on running lots of programs that other boards do not in fact run, that take up a lot of our resources. We spend a lot of money on busing. That's not necessary. We bus a lot of kids out of their community schools when we don't need to. And those are board decisions, historic board decisions that went against staff recommendations. And so we could put ourselves in a position where we have more supports in the schools, i.e. people working with our students instead of spending it on buses. And so I would ask ourselves again, and I apologize for repeating myself, to look at our part in this. And you know, we run I support alternate high schools, but we continue to run alternative schools that we don't need to run anymore. We have MFI that is maybe not necessary, and various other things that many other boards don't do. Our co-terminus board is much more streamlined than we are. And I always get comments, why do they have more support? Well, because they spend their money more efficiently. So let's take a look at what we could be doing to make things better for our kids, and not necessarily looking to everybody else. So I would like a comment from the director on that. Are we going to, again, it's been 10 years since, it's been 11 years, for instance, since we took a look at the alternative schools. Again, not the alternate high schools, the alternative elementary schools. So are we going to take a look at again? You know, it's been 11 years now. So we're, you know, that's a long time, as we said for the SRO program. So is there any notion that we'll take a look at that? Madam Director.
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair. Certainly that is always a conversation about reflecting on our programming, but no, the looking at alternative programming was not on our radar for focus. You will see the strategic actions in the subsequent report identify some of the work that we have set out for this strategic plan time, and that had not been an item that had been itemized for a focus as part of the 4-year plan.
Trustee Blackburn.
Very good. Thank you, Madam Director. And maybe it would take some leadership on the part of the Board of Trustees to get that going. Thanks.
Thank you. And I have Trustee Boothby next.
Thank you, Chair. I have a couple of questions. So we've talked about that a significant number of our children that are receiving suspensions and multiple suspensions are children that have IEPs. I'm just wondering when we have kids, all kids that are being suspended, what additional kinds of supports are we providing to these children in the immediate aftermath of the suspension? And then what kind of ongoing supports are we still applying and helping these children with what we're finding are the underlying reasons for the suspension?
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair. This time I will turn to one of our practitioners in the field. We have Vice Principal Cumberbatch, who is here with us. And so if I could ask him to respond to the question.
Thank you. I just want to make sure you can hear me.
Yes.
Yes. When we go through the process of suspension, one of the most important things is when they come back, the return meeting. The return meeting is a time to hopefully be able to begin a restorative process that hopefully even began before that. And we are looking at sometimes where further tiers of intervention might occur, where we would be potentially social work support might come in, an itinerant EA, that piece. The other thing is to look at as to what is the trigger that caused the behavior, to see whether it's a stress or a misbehavior that occurred, and see if there's ways that we can mitigate those triggers or eliminate those triggers so that the behavior does not happen again. What I can speak to right now during this pandemic that's unique to our site, maybe, it might be unique to Sir Guy, I'm not sure of the rest of the sites, is we've had a precipitous fall in suspensions. And we've figured out that we think there are 3 triggers that have been removed that have done the reduction in these suspensions. The focus on a single course seems to be better for our students. The students being in the classroom and not roaming around. The removal of late being mentioned by teachers. So there's no mention of when a student does come into being late. That was a significant trigger. And also just the nature of it, the focus on the child as the duty of care by the teacher, that refocusing during the pandemic. And we've seen a precipitous fall with those suspensions. But when we look at how to do it, I want to speak to Principal Copra's point, which is that the restorative practice is something that really needs to be developed. We need to consider how we can do this if we have the time to speak with the student and we engage fully and we can get the conversation going. The discretionary suspensions are less likely to occur. With our students at the school I'm at, there's expressive language. Expressive language is an area for growth for them. So again, this leads them into many difficulties where they're not understanding what's happening, and their way of crying for help is what appears as a misbehavior, but it's a stress behavior. So it is about bringing in the necessary supports of LST, SST. Also, the vice principal acts as a supporting agent for the child as far as bridging that piece.
Okay, thank you for that. And I'm encouraged to hear that. So I'm hoping that we're accumulating all of these learned lessons so that when COVID does allow us to return to our quote normal classroom practices, that we're not going to just go back to the things that now we're finding out are triggers and are problematic. So I hope, can you see any problem with us being able to adopt these new ways of doing things?
So through you, Madam Chair, I think perhaps I'll take that away from Vice Principal Cumberland at this time and respond. And that's a great question, because one of the things, Trustee Boothby, is that we are trying to capture some of these pieces. The challenge will be as we shift into, I won't say the term regular, but back into a post-COVID situation, I imagine, is how to hold on to and transfer some of these conditions that have been, that have helped some of our conditions for learning to be improved to serve our students better, how we're able to hold on to them, and how it is that we're able to create the kinds of layered opportunities that seem to work. Because as Vice Principal Cumberland spoke about, the one course at a time being an advantage for some students, for other students that has been very difficult to manage. So the challenge will be, how is it that we create a system that is not a one size fits all, because again, it's the conditions that we create that enable students to be successful. And we're learning that more as we interrogate this, this data.
Okay, thank you for that. My next question is, it's currently mandatory that there are no suspensions in grades K through 3, which I think is great. What and how are we managing otherwise?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think I'll turn the question again to Principal Copra, as she is the principal of a primary school, an elementary school. Principal Copra.
Thank you, Director. So how are we managing with K to 3? I just want to make sure I have your question correct.
That's right.
Suspension.
I mean, and I was a little surprised we had so many suspensions in K through 3. So now what are the strategies we're using to avoid the suspensions, which we're not allowed to do?
Right. So again, this is speaks to, I think, so many things, but at the core of it, the culture that is required around that broadly in the school. And that's not a quick and easy fix, right? And so this takes a while. It's a process for sure. There are lots of other things that we can do with kids. So working a lot, Andrew spoke to vice principals tend to do a lot of that work, although principals will do it, SSTs will do it, co-regulation with students. So you have a student who's escalating, and we are seeing some of those stress behaviors, particularly now with COVID starting to come out. The first couple of months are that sort of honeymoon period, but as we're seeing now, some of those are starting to rise. So our EAs do a lot of that work, right? And so a lot of that, a lot of it has been messaging and coming together as a staff repeatedly to remember that that students, when they are exhibiting these behaviors, there is a reason behind them, and we need to get to the core of what that reason is. We know that suspensions don't work. And so it's great that for young kids particularly, great that the K to 3 has officially been taken off, but you're absolutely right in that, you know, a 6-year-old is not learning a great deal by going home. And depending on what that looks like and the intersectionality of maybe some other pieces of their life, what that looks like, it's not going to solve the problem. So we do things like alternative learning opportunities for them, right? How can you make this right with your friend? We have time addressing lagging skills, right? So oftentimes it's a self-regulation piece, or it's, as Andrew has spoken, might be an expressive language piece. So we've got lots of adults in the building that can do that work with us. Parents are a huge part of that, right? And so again, that relationship piece where they play a really important role in terms of letting us in on any other pieces that we may need to know that are happening outside of school that get brought in, right? We don't leave ourselves at the door when we walk into a school building. And I think, again, all of those practices that we know, some of those pieces with parents where we are seeing escalated behaviors, I want to just put something out there that we haven't really talked about here, and that is that our schools represent, for some of our kids, for some of the kids that I work with, such trauma has been done to them historically in our system. If you are an Indigenous student in our system, there has been trauma that has happened for you. If you are a racialized student in our system, there has been historical trauma that has happened for many years. So walking in that building or asking one of my parents to come into that building to have that conversation about what's going on, notwithstanding the fact that we're in COVID times, we're not letting anyone into the building, that sometimes means that we need alternate spaces. We need other places to go to be meeting with people on grounds that are relationship building. They need, because we've been trying to do relationship, but if we always try to do relationship building in the way that it works within our structure, we will continue to do what we've always done. And so I think when we're talking about those behaviors with K-3, it's a lot of patience, and it's a lot of working with kids on where are the lagging skills at. If there's trauma involved, getting people from, whether it's Petra's team or it's community connections that we have. Again, many Indigenous community connections that we have here in Ottawa. Many other community connections that we can use to help students through that. But a lot of it is, it's not a sort of a quick and easy. This is messy, complex work that is, it's the nature of relationships. And so again, with little ones, it's a lot of patience, a lot of modeling of behaviors that we want to see, a lot of praise when we do see some great things happening. And again, all of those alternative learning opportunities and spaces that we can use with them.
Excellent. And I hope we bring those forward into the older grades as well then. So my last question is, Trustee Ellis talked a little bit about the mitigating factors with suspensions for children that have IEPs. And I'm wondering, I know it's mandatory in accordance with the Ed Act that we do look at mitigating factors, but do we kind of have a template, if you will, or an idea of how many mitigating factors and or what's the timeline that we try and employ those mitigating factors before we go to a suspension?
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair. I'll take a quick go at this and perhaps turn it to system principal. So this is, again, I go back to the comment I made earlier about no algorithm. And so when it is that we consider a variety of mitigating factors, certainly there are quite a variety of mitigating factors, and it's not necessarily a limited list. Because if there are realities that students are facing that may not be on that list or those examples, but we know that they are causing a situation for a student, that certainly does inform how it is that we proceed. So again, it's always nice to want to have a chart or a straight line approach from, this happens, this, or we've done this many times, and so therefore we'll move to the next thing. But it certainly is very much dependent on student by student, situation by situation, condition by condition. Assistant Principal Anderson, would you like to comment any further?
Thank you, Director. And yes, I mean, the only algorithmic piece around this is that principals are expected to consider the why and the context of every behavior and investigate all those potential mitigating factors before they make any decision, and that their real focus is to be on what is the student learning from the progressive discipline consequence, which may or may not be a suspension, and how is that supporting them in avoiding future inappropriate behaviors? That's the basis of progressive discipline, is that supportive and corrective approach. And so, you know, we implore our principals to look at that for every circumstance, for every child. And it's not, you know, the why in context and the mitigating factors are different for every child, even though the behavior may be the same behavior that's being displayed. So I don't know if that perfectly addresses your situation, your question, but certainly that's the effort that we're trying to make.
Well, I'm glad to hear it's more individualized and we don't have a strict quick way that we go from one step to the next step to the next step. So thank you, and that's all my questions.
If I may, Madam Chair, I just want to interject to one of the questions that Trustee Boothby asked, just for clarification for the record. Principal Copra was very enthusiastic in her response and really gave us a thorough perspective from a disciplinary, a discretionary suspension point of view for students K to 3, but it is important for the record that we do identify the fact that there is still a mandatory suspension that is applicable at that age, although it is very unusual and rarely used. There is still the expectation that if there is a mandatory cause, that outcome is applied.
Anything further, Trustee Boothby?
No, and thank you for that. I wasn't aware of that. I thought they had all been suspended. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Boothby. I have no other first-time speakers on my list, but before I go to Trustee Campbell for his second round, I would like to ask Trustee Penny if he would please take the chair, because I do have a question.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and go ahead.
Thank you. At our committee of the whole meeting, I did raise the question of the subjective judgments around suspensions as opposed to looking at them in terms of mandatory and discretionary. When I look at the language that's in the Act and the regulations and our policies, some of the things that are mandatory actually require a subjective judgment to at least some extent. Some of the things that are discretionary actually don't necessarily require a lot of subjective judgment on the part of the person who is considering possible disciplinary action. So I guess I wonder how we look at the subjective components in decision-making on the part of our school staff when it comes to whether or not to suspend a student. As the parent of a son who was, when he was little, talking all the time and in constant motion, our systems, our classrooms are not set up very well for children who talk all the time and are in constant motion. And I guess I have to ask, depending on whether or not your child is a racialized child, depending on whether or not your child has been identified as a student with special education needs, or depending whether or not you're the rich mom who comes and volunteers all the time, or whether you don't show up at your parent does not show up at school very often. How much do those things play into the decision making as to whether or not this student, if indeed the behavior of talking all the time and being in constant motion is impinging on other students' ability to learn? How much of that subjective judgment about the student and their circumstances comes into play when deciding whether or not to apply a disciplinary action? And I guess that's one of the big fat questions from my point of view.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Chair Scott. So I will take a go at your very large question. And it is in fact the crux of the matter. And I think that Trustee Campbell tried to take us there in the last time we went at this report and the data that is there. And so in a simple format, the answer is indeed there is ownership on the part of those of us who are leaders in the classrooms, leaders of schools, around our own bias in informing decisions that aren't discretionary. And that is why there is a big focus on training of staff around how it is to identify that very bias and to shift the thinking around making children behave. So it's not about making children behave, but it is about engaging students in our responsibility to create an engaging environment that supports all of our children. And so your question is about bias, and there's no question. Bias exists, and that is what has informed some of these disproportionalities that we see. And in order to address those, we have to be able to identify them, and we do that through that interrogation of the data, as well as the interrogation of our own behavior. And we heard Principal Copra and Vice Principal Cumberland talk about some of how those practices have changed because of the things that they have learned. So the question becomes, how do we institutionalize those changes so that we don't see them in pockets across the system, but in fact, we see them as the pervasive practice. So that there's much more to be said, but that's how I would respond to the question at this point.
I really appreciate the director's answer. I guess the final thing that I would say on this tonight is I would really like us to start asking ourselves the question whether the issue of behavior that is seen as unacceptable is an issue on the part of the student, or whether it is a situation where we should be admitting that what we have attempted to do to support and engage the student has failed, and that we need to do something different because it just doesn't work for all kids. And with that ends my question.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and back to you.
Thank you. And now go back to Trustee Campbell.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate your comments and the director's comments. I think that gets at some important stuff. I'm going to try and be rapid fire here with respect to some questions. Again, I'm trying to figure out, because again, we have to do a safe schools policy review this year, right? This very much fits into this conversation in terms of what kind of policy changes and I guess staff procedural changes might be indicated, right? So I guess to follow up on one of Trustee Ellis's questions, we used to get reporting by, I think Superintendent Farish had it, suspension reason code. And I believe that was stopped some years ago because the data was dirty and haphazard, wrong boxes were filled out, they weren't always filled out, etc. And I think there's a throwing up of the hands in despair. And I don't know if that information is now collected. And so I guess that's my first question is do we even collect that data? And do we have confidence or not in how clean it is?
Through you, Madam Chair, I'll ask Executive Officer Giroux to take this question.
I think there were a range of different issues. There was, first of all, we had multiple policies and we had criteria listed in each. There were some changes in ministry directive. There is some difference between mandatory and discretionary suspensions, some differences in the language between what was in the policy or in the legislation and what was in the software system. And then there are a couple of broader categories that have been referred to earlier, such as moral tone injurious to the school or things like that, that are broad and discretionary and can't be broken down further. So there were a whole host of contributing factors. Some of those have been addressed by some of the policy work we have done. Some of those will be addressed by the additional policy work and the changes in ministry direction. But that only gets at part of it. The other piece is more around what happens in the exercise of discretion and can you reasonably rely on those categories being interpreted the same way all the time. So those are the reasons why we changed the nature of the data collection and reporting.
Okay, great. So just to confirm, we don't centrally collect reason codes, and we don't feel confident reporting out on that on an aggregated basis because of these reasons. Is that correct? I just want to be clear.
The way the system was structured, we could not bring the clarity to the questions that were asked of us. Yes.
Okay, yeah, because it would be very interesting, for instance, by group, putting it out there, persistent opposition to authority, is that reason for suspension higher amongst certain racialized groups or not? I mean, it would be interesting to delve into some of this data. If it's not there, it's not there. I have another question though. Again, the Safe Schools policy currently directs that every school, and I mentioned this last time, develops its own Safe Schools policy. And I actually refer interested trustees and the public to the policy and the procedure 660, which very much goes into all the various progressive discipline steps and ideas, withdrawal of privileges and peer mentoring and referral counseling and restorative justice and restitution and, on and on, withdrawal privileges and on and on and on. This is 2008. Nothing's changed, right? So, nothing's new here. In a sense, it perhaps goes to our implementation more than anything else. And I guess my question here is, the policy requires that each school develop its own policy and procedure with respect to progressive discipline, which does go to the consistency question. However, it may be entirely appropriate that different schools may need different things. I guess my question though is, are we confident that every school does have a developed policy and procedure around progressive discipline?
Through you, Madam Chair, can I ask Assistant Principal Anderson to respond to the question, please?
Thank you, Director. And I think we have moved to every school's code of conduct. We're looking at progressive discipline and not code of conduct, but it's part of the same thing. The progressive discipline policies and procedures be aligned with our central approach. And so we have been making efforts over the last couple of years to get everyone closer to the same standard, yet still allow for some, small flexibilities in different school communities. But I would say, in a broad answer to your question, yes, every school has a policy and procedure, and it aligns with the central policy and procedure.
Thank you. A follow-up, are these policies, procedures publicly accessible?
I believe so.
These are just questions. The procedure calls for...
And you have 16 seconds left.
I can get this in. But you might have to put me back. The procedure asks every admin team to keep a record of all progressive discipline interventions. The nature of the progressive discipline approach, the outcome, any contact with a parent, guardian, date of the incident or behavior, et cetera, et cetera. Are we confident that this routinely occurs, or do we not know? Or I just would like to understand the state of the nation that way. And please put me back on the list.
So I will ask Superintendent Farish to address the question because one of the pieces here is that this does go to the supervision of schools through the superintendents of instruction as well. It doesn't just lie in the space of the superintendent of safe schools, but Superintendent Farish plays both roles. So would you kindly answer the question?
Of course, thank you, Director, and through you, Chair. I think you're referring to logging of actions, decisions, communications that we have with students with respect to progressive discipline and the ways that we document that in our schools. I would say that although there may not be one structure, one standard practice that's followed, that it is absolutely an expectation that principals and vice principals are tracking and monitoring the ways that they're engaging with students for that supportive, corrective, educative approach in terms of responding to different behaviors. And so again, because progressive discipline is on a continuum and doesn't, there are many opportunities to engage with students where it may not appear to be progressive discipline. We certainly hope it doesn't appear that way all the time, but that might be actually our intention, is to develop some learning, to develop some skills, as Principal Copra talked about, to really enrich the students' ability to have full participation in the learning, and also, as Chair Scott mentioned, reflect back to us on what are we learning about the conditions that we're responsible for when we're seeing some behaviors that maybe that we know are not helpful for student achievement and well-being. So I would say that we absolutely have logs, we have notes, we have documentations. We do mandate that communication happens with families, caregivers, guardians, and that would be an expectation, as Director Williams-Taylor points out, that each one of the superintendents of instruction would be working with their school admin teams to supervise for that. And I know that if we had an opportunity to have examples shared from my colleagues here who are in schools, we would hear some extremely good examples, exemplars, in fact, but I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. If you put me back, I just have 2 more questions. The third time should do it. Thank you.
And we are just a few minutes after 9 o'clock. I have 2 new first-time speakers. We still also have the report on tracking implementation of the strategic action plan to get to. Would trustees like to take the 9 o'clock break now and then resume this discussion and finish up with those who are currently on my list, including Trustee Campbell, and then move on to the strategic plan discussion? I think I will declare the 5-minute recess now then. And when we come back, we will have trustees Jennings, Huff, and Campbell, and then move on to the next item on our agenda. So 5-minute break. video on? Just so we know you're here. I think we have quorum back with us. So I will move on then to the speakers that we agree that I said we would get to on this item, beginning with Trustee Jenkins.
Thank you, Chair Scott, and thank you for the very interesting discussion this evening on how we react with students with challenges, and I appreciate that we used more of a restorative methodology. My question actually is, in the broader sense, do we support the students, the families of the children affected by the students who are being suspended or disciplined? What steps does our board take in supporting the families? And I guess a two-part question. What happens when we've tried to take as many steps as possible that we have in place that we still don't have success in changing the direction of the behavior of the child in question, the student in question? What are our end steps? You could answer.
Thank you, Trustee Jenkins. I'll ask Superintendent Farish to take the question.
Thank you, Director Williams-Taylor, and through you, Chair. Thank you for the question. It is really more of a continue to try. It's never really an end step kind of mindset, although I do completely appreciate that you're looking for a goal where there can be shared learning spaces which are conducive for everybody's learning. And oftentimes we have some scenarios where we're trying to learn, how do we respond better to the conditions? How is the environment impacting the students' ability to fully participate and demonstrate their learning and experience that the type of success that we want for everybody? So when we try different strategies, I think Principal Copra mentioned that you have multiple people that can be engaged in some of that solution finding or some of those looking at data to identify trends or patterns in behavior, and then trial some strategies as well. So as we're doing all of that work, you're right, we have to balance off the well-being and the learning environment for all of our students who are attempting to engage in ways that are the best for them. So we do, in some cases, look, and Principal Cooper mentioned this too, we look at the some alternate environments as well and try to build in some building some independence around some of our students' ability to have the loads of their academic programs on them and yet still managing the behaviors. And so I don't think I have a perfect answer for you, except that we expect that this is our ongoing work and that we do have just as much attention to any individuals who have been impacted by behavior. And the way that progressive discipline actually models out responses, it involves the attending to harm, attending to hurt, attending to ways that we, again, have to rebuild relationships in community and classrooms. So it very often is about making phone calls to families where students have been impacted. And if there's formal discipline levied. So for instance, if there is a suspension levied, if there was some type of a specific harm to a student, we would be talking to that family about the incident. We would be giving some specificity, but not complete. We would still not be breaching confidentiality. So there's a balance there, but we know that if we're working in communities, schools are communities, it's a subset of the broader community. So we need to be continuing to do the work through the ebbs and flows of how students are building their independence and their capacity to really experience their learning environments. And sometimes it really feels like it's hard going, and I appreciated Kristen, our Principal Copra, saying it's also heart learning. So we try to engender that type of compassion in the ways that we always center identities and looking for the ability to build compassion within our school communities as well. And the students in our classrooms really have shown us tremendous leadership in being able to support their peers in many, many cases.
Thank you for that. Sorry, just one additional question then. How do we support our students on our buses where, you know, they're sort of stuck with nowhere to go? And, you know, how can we help our students on our buses?
Through you, Chair. Right now, we really hope that our students are stuck in their seats on our buses as per our seating plan. However, you're absolutely right. Buses are just another dynamic, and that's part of the skill building, certainly, that we do incorporate into our curriculum so that there's a level of independence around knowing how to engage with my peers and that relationship building. And I think Principal Copra phrased it well when she said, learning how to be with one another and how to make things right, or being able to be in different environments. So field trips, bus rides, other unstructured playtime, for instance, during nutrition breaks, all of those things give us lots of opportunities to be building those skills and again, practicing those skills and reminding and praising for the ways that students are really showing gains and progress. We do have a specific way to help students if we have to respond to a serious incident on a bus, to help to intervene for safety, for sure. And that's one of the mechanisms that we try not to use, but we do work with OSTA, and mostly it would be OSTA in this case, where the bus driver would help us in that management and reporting, certainly any incidences that require reporting. And then we do have a follow-up process as well. But we're focusing on building the skills, the relationships that we know students need to feel that they belong to a community in order to participate in a community with positive contributions.
Thank you. That's it for me then. Thanks.
Thank you, Trustee Jennings. And we have next Trustee Huff.
Thank you, and through you, Madam Chair. Just one of those late evening Wendy comments here. I want to make a little bit of an esoteric summary of this. This has been a fantastically interesting conversation this evening. And something that is sitting here smacking me in the face is that sometimes the semantics surrounding a concept can serve to combine our thinking and our understanding of that concept. I think that the term progressive discipline is a case in point. I think that if we want to truly start looking at behavioral modification in schools, you're touching on all of these positive ways and these learning opportunities, and it's brilliant to see such a turn of approach. Give it a new name. It's time to give it a new name. It's time to set the stage for this from a positive perspective as opposed to a negative. That will inform every ounce of work that you do in this area if you just start from a different place. Maybe I'm a dreamer, but I honestly believe that there's something in a name. And so I would encourage you to start to think as you give a facelift to this concept, to how we deal with kids in the school, how we deal with behaviors, how we deal with misbehavior. Give it a new name. Give it a positive name. So there's my pontificating for tonight. Thank you for your work on this, Superintendent Farish. This has been a very interesting conversation.
Thank you very much, Trustee Huff. And that brings us back to our last questions from Trustee Campbell.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thoroughly endorse Trustee Huff's reformist visionary thinking there. I think that's a great idea. My last two questions are really about funding and money related questions. In paragraph 16 in the report, it says up top, funding has been allocated to school districts to help support the implementation, of these changes, quote unquote, in clear reference to paragraph 15, which is the JK to 3 change. So I'm assuming that funding is not meant to train or to investigate or to change things in other grades. So I guess my question is, are we using that funding from the ministry solely on the JK to 3? And if we believe that similar investment is required with respect to other grades, are we coming up with that money ourselves? What is that money? And I just like some explanation around that piece.
Through you, Madam Chair. So I think there you are speaking to some earmarked funds, and I believe that Superintendent Simmons is probably best positioned to respond as they pertain to our mental health structures. So Superintendent Simmons, please.
Thank you, and Chair, through you, we did receive a PPF, and I can't for the life of me remember what that stands for now. Partnership and Priorities Fund, I think. And a certain amount of that money, 10% of it was supposed to be specifically directed at mental health supports for students in kindergarten to grade 3. We are joined this evening by Dr. Duschner, and she can add a couple more details around the planning for those funds.
Just to be clear, we are talking about the regulation 440/20 here, right? But that's what paragraph 15 is about that I referred to.
So the fund, so 4420, as I understand it, is the section that has removed the discretionary suspensions.
That's what paragraph 15 is about. And paragraph 16 says there are funds received to implement paragraph 15.
That's correct. So
okay.
We did receive, yes. So Dr. Duschner, I think you're here. There she is. So a couple of comments around our planning so far as it relates to the kindergarten to grade 3 students at risk of being suspended, support for those students.
Certainly. Thank you. Good evening. Thank you, Superintendent Simmons, and through you, Madam Chair. As Superintendent Simmons has mentioned, 10% of the enhanced mental health funding that we obtained from the ministry this year is to be allocated to support mental health services for children in kindergarten to grade 3, and the focus of that is to promote positive student behavior. So what we are really trying to do with that funding is twofold, really. One is to build capacity for our educator teams that work with kindergarten to grade 3 students to better understand their students' profiles, not only from an academic perspective, but really understanding the whole child. And with that, we have created, and we are in the process of creating some additional online learning modules for staff. They are outlined in the suspension report. One is on implicit bias, so really helping educators understand how their attitudes, perspectives, and biases impact how they respond to students and what behaviors they engage in, and how that then impacts on students' behavior. So it becomes a really cyclical pattern of behavior between students and their educator staff. The other area that we're developing online learning around is in understanding big emotions. So you've heard Vice Principal Cumberland and Principal Copra talk about lagging skills and stress behavior. So really helping educators understand what stress behavior is. Particularly in young children, we see much more fluctuation in what we call big emotions, so anger and anxiety and frustration, and providing some strategies in terms of how best to support those fluctuating emotions to help children manage those emotions more effectively at the younger age levels. And the third piece around that is actually a module on culturally informed practices. So looking at how you take all of that information information as you understand the child, and engage in practices that are relationship focused, because we know that relationships are the best predictor of learning, whether that's academic learning or social emotional learning. And we know that the educator and student relationship is one of the highest predictors of academic achievement. So really focusing in on the importance of relationship building, genuine, authentic relationships. And then from there, working on those conditions that will create that sense of belonging and helping children truly feel that they matter, that they're valued, that they're cared for, so that they're in a position to really learn and thrive. In addition to the online learning piece, we're supplementing that with some online coaching and also some in-person coaching and mentoring, so that as educators are developing those skills, our team is in there to support that learning in a real timely way.
Sounds like a great use of the money. Can I ask how much money we're talking about here?
The overall funding, I believe, and I don't have the exact amount, but it's in the neighborhood of 300,000.
And sorry, 10% of that is going towards this?
Exactly.
So 30,000 is spent on this initiative for JK to 3.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
It's important to recognize, though, that these online learning modules that we are developing are targeting certainly grade kindergarten to grade 3, but it's also certainly information that is totally relevant for educators in the junior and intermediate and senior grades as well. So that learning can be extended and expanded to those grade levels as well.
So that's good news, and maybe it'd be efficient use of money. 30,000 doesn't sound like a lot to affect a general support change and system cultural change. But I mean, obviously, there are a lot of thought has gone into this. But I do wonder whether at budget time we need to look into this further. I do have one last money question, and that is. Sorry, my computer's acting up here. Don't dock me time. And that is VP Cumberland. And I don't want to, this is not his statement. He might not want to make this statement. But at one point he suggested, as I recall, I made a note, that VPs will follow through on the entire, or maybe I was extrapolating, it could be my fault. But will follow through and do what they can with respect to the entire, suite of progressive discipline. Let's not call it that. Think of some new word. And investigate, the roots of behavior and all these kinds of good things. But then he added, when there's time to do so. And I guess my question is, I do wonder what kind of workload we're putting at the feet of our admins, and in terms of potentially enhanced expectations here. And not to disregard the opinions of others, I do think we have to look perhaps at things on a school-by-school basis, at least to some extent. I mean, these are the satellite delivery centers, right, that we have in the system. And if the transactional loads, case management loads are concentrated at certain delivery sites, we have to recognize that. We can't be blind to that. And I do wonder whether we need to importantly look at, semi-serious shifts of support HR to schools on this basis. Because it's all fine and well, right, to talk about training. It's all fine and well to talk about changes in culture. But at the end of the day, if there isn't time, I mean, restorative justice takes more time, right? If there isn't time to effect these things, are we asking too much of potentially overburdened admins at schools with very high transaction loads in these areas? I guess that becomes a funding question or a budget question for me. So I just like a staff comment, and that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Campbell. And you've asked such a simple question as your last question. Thank you so much. And you can't see my face, but I'm being a little bit tongue-in-cheek there. So the question is a very complicated one because you are right. there is a growing responsibility and a growing load of practice. So there's no question about that. The question about what is the nature of the resourcing to support this shifting practice is another good question for contemplation. And I don't think that there's a principal or a vice principal in our system who would not agree that resourcing the support of the shifting practice is important. That said, I would also balance that conversation and that perspective with the shifting practice in the classrooms from the point of view of the way that we engage students, the way we engage families, the way we engage teaching also has an impact on some of that outcome. So we could, you notice a lot of people's cameras went on because there would be a lot of interest in responding, and it would be probably quite a lengthy discussion to have. But I would try to simplify the answer by saying, yes, you are right. We do need to think about how we resource the supports for this expected shift. But I would also say to you that the shift is dispersed. It doesn't sit simply at the feet of the principal or the vice principal, but it indeed begins in the classroom as well. And many of our educators are embracing that. And the shift in classroom practice is evident in many of our classrooms, and that has had an impact on the engagement of not just students, but their families as well, because this whole piece around how it is that we ensure student success is in fact a very, the parent engagement and family engagement is a key factor in that. And that's one of the things that over the last 5 to 8 years, I would say that we've embraced a lot more actively as an educational system. And that has yielded a positive outcome from the point of view of the conditions for learning in classrooms.
Thank you very much for that. That does me. I look forward to seeing some of this conversation hopefully reflected in budget proposals to come later this year. Thank you.
Thank you. And I said we would hear the last two first-time speakers and finish up with Trustee Campbell's final round. And we are now going to move on to report 20-107, tracking implementation of the strategic plan. Madam Director.
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair. I'm just going to flip to my agenda. So indeed, we do have attached for trustees an updated strategic action plan with an outline of what we've been doing around our strategic actions. So trustees, of course, led the way in creating and developing our strategic plan for 2019 to 23. And last school year, the staff did undertake to identify specific actions to deliver on the goals identified in that plan. And so that you will find in Appendix A, not only what the actions were, but also how what the work was to move those actions forward and where we landed with that. In Appendix B, what you will find is the updated plan for 2020-2021. And you will notice that if you were to compare the two, that there are some of the actions have in fact been amalgamated, some have been eliminated, some have been reduced because we did share when we first brought the strategic plan forward that we anticipate that there is learning that has to be undertaken and it has to be responsive. A part of our process over the course of the year has been to be monitoring the actions, or in other words, a cadence of accountability. And so we have been meeting as a team to look at the actions, monitor traction, monitor implementation, and reflect on whether these were the right actions to move towards the goal. So as you can see, we've refined the plan for 2020-2021, and it does reflect a nuance that was not present in the first plan, and that includes a column around how it is that we take action to ensure sustainability. Our practices that have been identified there are not simply just procedure and policy, because we do know that shifting procedure and policy influences sustainability of some of the shifts that we are trying to put into place. So I would say that it would include but not be limited to. We may also be looking at, and some of those boxes are indeed empty, because as we continue to learn over the course of the year, we may be looking at organizational structural changes that may populate those boxes to inform some of the sustainability questions around the shifts that we are looking to make, or as Trustee Campbell just referenced, the possibility of indeed staffing opportunities, roles that don't currently exist, that ought to exist to ensure that the strategic actions result in sustained changes that we are hoping to make. And so as we can see, when we look at the strategic action plans taken as a whole, they are intended to reflect not just staff practice, but trustee leadership as well, because it is an amalgamated effort. Finally, in order to ensure that we are in fact moving on the promise of the commitments that we have made, we're making them publicly. And so you will find that the strategic action plan is here today as a part of the board package, and is indeed available for public reference. And we're also committed to internal as well as public commentary on our progress as we continue to monitor the moves. Before I move to questions for trustees, I'd like to extend my thanks to Strategic Business Analyst Andrea Rahim, who has been working diligently at the side of the senior staff, not only to help to monitor the work, but to capture and document the progress that we are making, and to ask us some strategic questions to really push our thinking, as well as, of course, Executive Officer Giroux, who again, whose strategic mind is impeccable, and who has really helped to inform our practice. The whole senior team is implicated in this work, as you can see, because again, it is our commitment to work in an integrated fashion to move these particular actions to see positive change, and change that is sustained in our system in the interest of the betterment of our student experience and student outcomes as a whole. So I am happy to take any questions at this time.
Thank you, Madam Director. And I will begin with Trustee Fisher.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I guess the question that I have when we look at this particular action plan, as you know, Director, we're continuing to move forward our discussion on the annual work plan. And I guess I'm struggling a little bit to see where the two sort of interface with each other, because what I see here is, probably more to do, or more in line, I think, with, a lot of activities and priorities that you're trying to advance as the CEO of the organization. And sitting on top of that, there's probably a smaller set of things that the Board of Trustees perhaps wants to focus on, as part of the strategic plan. So I'm wondering if you just give me a sense of sort of where does the board work plan, where does this strategic action plan sort of interface with each other? Because I see, I don't see them as merged as perhaps you do, or in the way that you do. So can you just talk about how the two are going to relate to each other, and how do we move forward with that work plan discussion that is continuing to be shaped, I guess?
Thank you, Trustee Fisher, and through you, Madam Chair. The first thing I would start with is the fact that the strategic plan that trustees approved and were a very key part of informing and developing almost 2 years ago now, has in fact set the groundwork for these actions. And so when we look at the key goals that have been identified, starting with champion high expectations for all students and all programs, and running through the whole document, that this strategic plan was in fact developed in concert with trustee direction and ultimately approved by trustees, left to the staff to establish and identify actions that would bring us forward to moving the system towards these goals. On the right-hand side of the tracker from 2020-2021 plan, much of the work around the sustainability piece will speak to some of the ways where trustees may engage in some of the decision-making that allow us to make some of these pieces sustainable. So for example, speaking about policy and policy adjustments, speaking about staffing adjustments or organizational adjustments, while some of those things may emerge from the minds of staff, it is in fact through trustee engagement and approval that we see those pieces moving forward. Some of these items have also been a part of some of the trustee discussions as well through some of the professional learning structures or meetings, as well as items that have been raised by trustees. One of the things that we do recognize, and I think that this is where Trustee Fisher is going, is that we don't have the sequence quite in the place where the trustee work plan comes first there and then informing the strategic action plans. That said, we certainly did build the strategic actions on the direction that came out of the original strategic plan for 2019 to 2023.
Trustee Fisher?
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I do see that we're at a sequence here, and I think it's important as a board, as a senior team, that we try to find a cycle that's going to work. Because if we continue to be out of sequence, I think it's going to frustrate many. As we try to find a way of connecting the dots, and I do appreciate that. There was a discussion around the strategic plan, and that sets out the context for the next 4 years. But, sort of beyond that, we need to find a cycle in a relationship where the board is identifying its priorities for the year. And ultimately that helps set and inform, the work that the senior team will undertake in a given year, because ultimately that then sets in motion the very things that we want to have oversight over, or we want to monitor, both in terms of our sort of, our day-to-day good governance responsibilities, but the special projects or, special priorities that we want to take on, from 1 year to the next. So I think getting on cycle, getting in sequence is going to be critically important. Otherwise, I think there's just going to be a lot of mismatch and frustration and perhaps maybe, misspent, sort of energy and focus, which I don't think is great for the organization from a governance standpoint. So, I think what we have before us is what it is. And I think we need to find a way of building some bridges to the work plan and sort of reverse engineering it. But I do think as we're doing that, at least for the remainder of this year, we do need to think about how we can get on cycle and in sequence. So.
Thank you, Trustee Fisher. Moving next to Trustee Campbell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate the conversation on both sides. One thought, I can't remember whether staff presented this to us many months ago or not, or is just an idea in my mind. But what might help in regard to Trustee Fisher's concerns is if we had, at a very high level, a multi-year staff plan in terms of, of the strat plan, year 1 to 2, we expect to be able to, implement X, and 2 to 3 this, and basically have a multi-year plan. But that then we should, as a whole, be able to map to the strat plan, right? Maybe not year by any given year. Yeah, it might be out of sequence, but we should be able to see basically the holistic plan, right? And my idea, I mean, we all agreed, I think early on in our strat planning sessions, that we would be embracing agile and flexibility, right? Everybody remember that? Creative thinking. So to me, such a high level multi-year plan would be evergreen, and it might need to evolve under pressure circumstances. And, well, COVID's a decent example. But I think that vehicle might go some way to bridging. It's just an idea. The only other thing I'd just like to set as again a high level idea, and I do see some of this in the staff thinking, and I guess kudos is. I mean, this is going to sound very strange, I know, but in a way, I think we should be embracing COVID. And I know that will sound pretty strange, but as a lot of people have noted, right, COVID has revealed inequities, right, in society in a number of ways. COVID has stressed all kinds of systems, not just the OCDSB. And we have scrambled, staff have scrambled as an organization to pivot in incredibly short timeframes for something like a school board to adapt to circumstances. And not that that's something you would want to do every year, oh my God. But the fact remains that when the will is there and the pressure's on, we can think out of the box, right? We can be really creative about how we approach things. We don't have to have teeny tiny little incremental changes all the time. And so I'm sort of hoping that in a sense, we embrace some of the lessons learned coming out of COVID, and that encourages us to think big going forward. And as well that we're immersed in COVID and really hopeful that we haven't, it's been a huge impact on everybody, on staff, on everybody. And it's wounded our strategic plan. We've hopefully haven't lost a full year, but maybe in terms of really moving forward seriously on things. And so my hope is that we approach COVID through the lens of the strat plan and through the lens of equity. And I do look forward to, reports on staffing ratios for various schools. I do look forward to, I'd like to know who is in our virtual schools. I'd like to know what the outcomes are. I'll finish there, but I'm just hoping we can leverage and in a weird way embrace COVID. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to answer that.
Did you wish to comment?
Yes.
Director?
Thank you, Trustee Campbell. I think your points are very well taken. And in fact, I really would like to point out what I believe we have done to actually allow, while it is, I wouldn't say we've embraced COVID certainly, and the situation we're in certainly has advanced some of the work that we had identified as key goals around some of our instructional practices and our practices around engaging staff. So for example, when we had on there modernizing learning systems and learning opportunities for our professional staff as well as for students, a lot of the work that we have done around professional development has become more personalized, more direct, more just in time, and more effective with less money because we haven't been sending people out into big conferences and doing things like that. And so when you talk about how it is we embrace an opportunity to make change quickly and then how to keep it enshrined in practice, we shifted some of the language we used in our strategic action plan because that was in the plan to do that. And I do remember Trustee Huff asking a question a year and a half ago about how it is that we're going to make professional learning more modernized and more streamlined and more appropriate to have impact. And I believe that we have indeed done that. because COVID has forced an acceleration. So I would also say that during the time of COVID, the conversation about equity certainly was one that was on the table before and has significantly been accelerated during this time. And I think that some of the other matters that have happened over the course around social justice over the course of the last several months have accelerated the appetite to accept and to see us deliver the roadmap, which is our strategic plan around equity, which is very precise, very specific, and moves us forward. So I would counter to suggest that while I do agree with the trustee wholeheartedly, as a matter of fact, that this unfortunate scenario has in fact created an opportunity that we need to maximize, that it has not in fact derailed our plan. It has caused us to learn faster and to move faster, to respond better, and to be more specific around what we expect as impact. The last comment I would have to the trustee's remarks is just a reminder that the agility that we have been able to exercise around some of these moves that we wanted to make has been supported by funding from the ministry as well as flexibility from the ministry. Certain barriers have been removed. Certain structures have now come out of play that have allowed a concentration on certain practices over others. Certainly, it has created a challenge in some of our typical systemic practices, but it has also opened a way. So there is something to be said about creating spaces created to allow for certain local practices to take hold.
Very much appreciate the director's comments. I think your characterization of things might be more accurate than mine on reflection, and I appreciate them very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Campbell. I have Trustee Penny next.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm just looking at the big picture of this plan, and to tell you the truth, in software we sort of call this a little bit of a Kanban chart, which is sort of a Japanese management philosophy. And I'm actually very impressed with how the boxes are filled in and how the statuses are done. It looks very, very comprehensive. And I think that actually, if trustees would take a very, very close read of it, they get a real good sense of what is going on. And it actually speaks to the leadership of the team actually on how the statuses are being reported and the progress so far. And I am encouraged about the next year chart. And yes, there's some boxes that are not filled in, but I think that really sets the stage for those things. And all the topics that we have been discussing and a lot that we have not been discussing are there. And actually, it's very comprehensive reporting on them. And I'd just like to know who's the architect behind these charts, Madam Director? Who is the secret weapon that you've got doing all this stuff?
As I referenced, manager, sorry, I've forgotten her title. Andrea Rahim has been one of the key people behind it, and she has been taking our input, our thoughts, our discussions, our one-to-ones, as well as our huddle groups, and has created this way of tracking the information.
Yes, once more, congratulations and thanks a lot, and keep up the good work.
Thank you, Trustee Penny.
Are there any other first-time speakers to this? If not, I will go to a second-time speaker, Trustee Fisher.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. And I just wanted to pick up on a couple comments and reflections from Rob. I think ultimately, again, when I come back to the work that's been presented here, and as Keith said, it's robust. There's a ton of stuff and worthwhile stuff, on this chart in so many different ways. And I think what we really need to try and figure out is ultimately, what are the major things? And again, maybe this comes back to the work plan, but what are the major things that as a board of trustees, we need to connect to, we need to monitor, we need to see on the agenda on a regular basis. Because if we try to put all of this stuff on our agenda, we're never going to sleep, right? So And so I suspect like this is a plan where there's a lot of day-to-day things that have to happen, and rightfully so. And there's a prioritization there in terms of what the CEO is trying to drive from the top down. But there's a layer of this that then needs to be drawn up and connected to, what the board needs to be focused on. And I guess that's where I'm still kind of, figuring out where the two worlds collide, right? Because it can't be, and this gets back to our earlier discussion about, just governance principles. And, is it the board driving staff? Is it the staff driving the board? Is it a combination of both, right? And in a perfect world, there needs to be that synergy, right? And so I'm still struggling a little bit to see how this work elevates up into the things that we need to pay attention to as a board, and how do we monitor it, and how do we make sure we're doing the things that we need to do at the board level to support whatever systematic or transformational changes that the CEO and the senior team are trying to achieve in a given year, because there's a lot of stuff here. So I just wanted to make that final point, because I don't think it's solely in staff's hands to sort of figure out this year or even on a multi-year basis. I don't think it's our job to say, well, we've done the strategic plan, now it's over to you to figure out for the next 3 years. We've got to be in that conversation somewhere, and I guess that's what I'm still trying to figure out where the connection points are, particularly back to the work plan that we're still working on.
I think it might be helpful to remind folks that there is an established cycle in our policy. We are out of cycle because of COVID and a decision to delay some pieces. So the board work plan, the board's annual evaluation cycle sets up a process for the board self-reflection and or comprehensive evaluation, depending on the year, and then the identification of those areas of focus for the year. And that conversation is supposed to come forward earlier in the year, and that helps to set. And I think the other piece that gets to this, that tries to really build on what Trustee Fisher is getting at, is that work plan that comes from the staff takes into account the board's conversations throughout the year. So it's not so much a staff direction, it's ongoing monitoring and an end of, in a normal cycle, an end of year assessment about what are the things that the board is looking for, what have we heard, what does that look like, what have we achieved, how do we rebalance. So there is a cycle there, and we are a little bit out of cycle because of COVID. But certainly, hopefully once we've got that work plan in place, or that conversation next step, we'll see the synergy between them.
Thank you, Ms. Giroux. I'd like to move on then to first-time speakers, Trustee Schwartz.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and I'll be quick. I'll echo a lot of what Trustee Fisher was saying with respect to ensuring that things are aligned, and understanding, of course, this year is a bit of an exception. One question I do have, though, is in reference to the 2020-21 activities or planned activities. I guess when I look at the tracked report from 2019 and 2020, there's a number of areas which the status was, you had 1 bar versus 3 or 4. And so just wondering what the carryover then, are those activities that are potentially multi-year in nature and you'll continue to report? Because I don't necessarily see how you're moving them from 1 year over to the next. And obviously, if they're not completed, how those activities, do they just stop, or are you continuing them in some way? And how then are you tracking the status of the activity and completion? And then tracking it back, as Trustee Fisher was referencing, tracking it back then to sort of that larger strategic plan, and more importantly, the work plan as well.
Thank you, Trustee Schwartz. So as I said earlier, one of the things that you will see is that when you do a comparison between the two, if you were to print them out and lay them side by side, you would see that there are certain strategic actions that have been removed or amalgamated with others. When we started this work, the approach that we were taking was not one that had been taken before. And so we recognized that we were doing our best thinking at the time that we developed that plan. One of the things I did talk to trustees about is that a key part of the work was ensuring that we continue to monitor these plans. So the actions that are identified as strategic actions are not in fact typical operational actions, but rather actions that we developed, thought about, envisioned, because it spoke to moving a change in the organization. As we worked together last year and we monitored and met and looked at what we were learning, it became clear that some of the identified actions were probably not the right action to move the strategic change that we were looking to do. So some of them indeed have been eliminated because as they were started, it was thought that this is not the right direction, or that direction is should be more efficiently and effectively reflected with some others. And so when you look at this, you will see that there are some amalgamations, some things have been removed. And our goal this year is that the actions that have been identified here are more precise around moving change. And so the goal would be that at the end of this year, you would see an advancement in all of the boxes in all of these, because we believe that we have been more strategic and more streamlined in the approach that we have identified for strategic actions for this year.
Okay, and just a supplemental question then, or comment. So it would be helpful, I guess, when you're showing these kinds of reports and showing progress, and then showing an action plan for the following year, that you're identifying not necessarily where you've amalgamated, because I think that's fairly self-evident, but where you've removed in particular, and maybe even just in a footnote why. Because there's a lot of activities that were noted for 2019 school year that just sort of seem to have fallen off without sort of some way of identifying how it's rolling into this year. So that's it. It was just noteworthy, because it does seem that in some of the strategic actions, either if they're not continuing, that there needs to see some continuity, or at least if it's completed, it's done, you're reporting this activity is completed, we're now moving on to something else. Overall, I like the structure. I very much also, I agree with Trustee Penny. I like seeing that sort of those status bars. I think that's quite helpful in terms of reporting, but I'm just missing that one other piece.
I appreciate that, Trustee Schwartz, and that's helpful information, because a key part of the work is, again, the transparency and the reporting, the cadence of accountability to the Board of Trustees. And so if we are missing a step, it's important that that's identified and that's duly noted. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
And before we leave this item, I would like to ask Trustee Penny if he would please take the chair for a moment, because I have a comment.
Yes, go ahead, Trustee Scott.
Thank you very much. It's interesting listening to the discussion on this, because we have so many pieces that are happening under our strategic plan because of the nature of that plan. One of the things that was really important when we developed the plan was that it left an opportunity for every member of staff at every level in the organization to be able to find an action that they could take that would help to move the work of the plan forward. And so it has really permeated the entire district in a way that I don't recall any of our previous strategic plans having done. I think it's really useful to know what things have been dropped, but I also commend staff for dropping things, because the bottom line is you don't want to carry something over from one year to the next if it didn't work, if it wasn't the right action then you shouldn't be looking at continuing to do it if you have found that it wasn't the right action. It would be helpful for us to know that. The other thing is the connection between the work under the operational strategic action plan and the board's work plan itself. I see reflected in this plan a number of things that are very, very key actions from the point of view of the board. But a lot of the things that are in the staff work plan are not things that the board is going to be directly involved in. They are things we need to monitor, but we don't have a direct role to play most of the time in making those things happen. There are, however, some key things where we do, as a board, have a key role in making them happen. They are our work. That work does belong to us. And those, I believe, are the things that belong in our work plan. They will fit and they are reflected in places in the staff strategic action plan. I do think that there are connections that can be made and will be made. And I would like to express my personal appreciation to staff for bringing this forward with the detail and the organization that they have displayed in this report. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Trustee Scott.
And that moves us on then to the next item on our agenda, which is the report from our OPSPA representatives, if there is one.
Not tonight, Madam Chair.
So no report for us tonight from OPSPA. We have no matters for information that are attached to this agenda. So that brings us to new business. Are there any items of new business? Trustee Boothby.
Thank you, Chair. I'm wondering through you to staff, we've been seeing in the media that a couple of school boards are saying that when they have snow days, they will be closing the schools. And that is due to COVID and the restrictions of putting cohorts together and the recognition that we also have not all staff can make it in when it is snow days as well. So I'm wondering if we have had an opportunity to think about what our policy will be in our board around that, and if we've had any discussions with Ottawa Public Health on strategies around snow days.
Thank you, Trustee Boothby. And indeed, yes, we have. We have had the conversation amongst the senior staff as well as with Ottawa Public Health, along with the other districts in Ottawa. We do recognize that school closure is a very big decision. It has a big impact on our community. We also recognize that the safety of our students is a priority. And we realize as well that with the expectations for safety because of the pandemic situation, that some of our practices, like you have identified, combining classes and such, are not options at this time. We also have had discussion and are monitoring decisions of the boards around us. And so this is in fact a decision point that we need to consider. We haven't taken a decision on this item at this point. What we have decided to do is to monitor the situation with our status quo structures and expectations. We did indeed have snow a couple of days ago, yesterday, in fact, it seems like longer now. And we found that we were able to operate well. And so at this point, we have not moved to a blanket statement around school closure. That said, the conversations that we have had, should we move in that direction, is first and foremost, lots of ample warning for our community, a lot of information ahead of time that gives people planning time and time to anticipate. So at this point, we are remaining status quo, but that is not to say that it won't change ultimately. We will follow the data and we will make decisions as it seems appropriate for the safety of our students and our staff.
Trustee Boothby.
Okay, thank you for that.
Thank you very much. I have Trustee Blackburn next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And through you, I'd like to inform the board that I've given notice of motion that I would like the board to consider hiring a full-time trans and gender diverse student support coordinator. I'm hoping that we can have that discussion at the December board meeting, as I do believe it's urgent. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And Trustee Campbell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just following up, it could have been in the could well have been in the flow of memos from staff and so forth, but I didn't recognize it, and it may not have come out yet. I just wanted to follow up with respect to Mr. Street's delegation to the board from a month ago with respect to technology proposal request, and staff are going to get back to him and us in terms of a response. Have we developed one yet, or do we have a timeline by which we think we'll be able to, as the case may be?
Thank you through you, Madam Chair. I approved that memo today. I did see it, and the author has just turned his camera on. So Superintendent Lehman, if you would care to respond.
Sure. Through you, Chair. Thank you for the question, Trustee Campbell. So yes, we did we're able to put some information together. We did look at two of the software programs that the delegate did share. One was RazKids. Would cost us about $350,000 to provide that as a one-year unlimited subscription. And JLE, which is a JK or a kindergarten to grade 6 resource, would run us, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was around $200,000 or $250,000. We do have other programs that are software programs that are available. That is noticed, it's identified in the memo, and one is Epic, one is Sora, and the other one, I'm sorry, it's just escaping me at this point, but they do provide both leveled books in English and French. And so there are other opportunities, and then there are other opportunities as well for resources that are in print material as well. And we do have strategies in place that we've worked with Ottawa Public Health on as well to ensure that they are safe for our students and families. So that should be coming to you soon, that memo, and certainly happy to answer any questions from trustees if they have further information or further questions related to that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Looking forward to reading the memo. Sounds very complete, and staff are the experts in doing cost benefit analysis of this kind of stuff. And obviously, if they think that something should be proposed in budget, they'll do so. But I'll read it with interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Trustee Campbell. And I have no other hands on my list, so I would like very much to take a moment to say thank you to all of you, all of my colleagues on the board and all of our senior staff team for the good work they've done to support our students through this year. And I would especially like to express my appreciation to Vice Chair Penny, to Committee of the Whole Budget Chair Sandra Schwartz, to Audit Committee Chair Mark Fisher, and to the chairs of all of our various advisory committees who have worked really hard in sometimes very difficult meeting circumstances through a pandemic, and nevertheless have managed to keep the work moving forward and provide some good decisions and some good advice to the board as we have worked our way through what has been an incredibly challenging year. Our next meeting will be our organizational meeting on the 1st of December. And I hope that we will see continuing interest in moving our strategic plan forward and continuing the work that we started with our first crack at developing the strategic plan when we were mostly newly elected. We've had one change of trustee this year with welcoming Trustee Bell to replace Trustee Bronovan. We have a very good mix of views and opinions and some very lively discussions. I think that suggests that we actually have a remarkably healthy board, and it's up to you and due to you. So thank you all very much. And with that, I will declare our meeting adjourned. We have reached the end of our agenda.